He just wanted to do something big. He always gave that energy off. I want to grow. I want to give back.
Police was everywhere, and I kept saying, you know, can I see my son? Can I see my son?
Like someone stuck a knife in my chest and just kept turning it. How can this be? You know, he was just here, and now he's gone.
He had 3 gunshot wound injuries, all to the back.
By the time that any detectives arrived on scene, there were no witnesses.
They were not getting any information at all.
They know everything about each other. These were well-known friends.
The disrespect would make him look weak, and that he could not stand for.
3 men came from around the corner, and they had masks on and hoodies.
This was not an accident. This was not a coincidence. This was payback.
It's November 2014 in Toledo, Ohio.
We are a city that is divided into several different areas. We have North Toledo, we have the east side, which is divided from the rest of Toledo from a river. So we're on the edge of Lake Erie. So we have South Toledo and West Toledo.
It was November 14th, about 8:45 in the evening, in the north side of Toledo, and there were calls coming into 911 from shots being fired.
It was a very cold, bitter night, very dark. It was the middle of November.
The shooting occurred right in front of Chase Elementary School. Once the paramedics arrived to the scene, they noticed 2 young people. One was a teenage girl, and the other was a young man who had seemingly been shot 3 times, had 3 gunshot wounds. The young girl was there trying to console and hold his head.
She was talking to him and holding him until fire arrived.
Paramedics take over.
So this young man was not responsive, but he was still alive. They did everything that they could try to do to save his life.
He had 3 gunshot wound injuries in his body, and they were all to the back.
They do an ID check, and they discover that it's 17-year-old Carter Coley, who is a senior at Woodward High School in North Toledo.
His condition is life-threatening, so they got to load him in an ambulance as soon as possible because his life is on the line.
Detectives with the Toledo Police Department arrive.
We already had crews on the scene. When I arrived, the victim was no longer there. There was some clothing on a sidewalk in front of the school, and I was told that that's where the victim had fallen. Everybody was gone.
As they go to the scene, they're trying to find witnesses, but no one's there to be found. Everybody's disappeared all of a sudden, so they're looking for witnesses at this time. Even the young woman who was holding Carter, she was gone. She disappeared from the scene.
Nobody wanted to stick around. Whatever happened, people were out of there. Me and my wife, Tamara Coley, we got married in 1994. She's my soulmate. I adopted her 2 kids from a previous marriage. I adopted them, and then we had our own kids.
After the birth of their daughter, in 1997, Tamara gave birth to a son.
We had just had Kiana, and then she came to me and she said, "Baby, I think I'm pregnant again." I said, no way. And then Carter was born.
I think he was just in a little bit of shock like I was, and very happy. I was always praying that it was going to be another boy. You know, I'd have 2 girls and 2 boys, and I just thought that was the perfect little family.
I wanted a junior, so we gave him the name
CJ as Carter Jr., and it just stuck with us.
He was just so beautiful. He had these dimples in his face that were, you could like stick your fingers in them and it would go deep. And I just looked at my husband, I said, uh-oh. So we're gonna have trouble with this one, meaning girls, you know, because he was just so cute, so beautiful, perfect.
From a young age, Carter had a large group of friends.
Back in 2002, Sherman Elementary, 5 years old, man. First day of school, there was a lot of stuff going through my head, and all of a sudden I just seen a little light-skinned dude, Charming, has way of the girls, man. And I was always like, I want the girls. You know what I'm saying? I want to be his friend.
He was definitely goofy. Just somebody, he was fun to be around, like every time. Like our whole group, we would always laugh.
One of Carter's friends, Shanta Jones, had a special place in the Coley home.
I started coaching football. I coached football for 6 years for all the kids. I was like this father figure to all the kids for our neighborhood. A lot of kids looked up to me like I was Coach Carter. And Shantae, lived with us a lot.
I loved Shanta. He was really good. He'd help, take the garbage out, this, that. Is there anything I can do for you, Miss Coley?
I would get him to practice, get him to school, and Shantae was mainly #1 person there a lot. He was always at our house.
Which also meant Shanta went to church with the Coleys.
If you stayed on Friday nights, you had to go to Friday night service. If you stayed Saturday nights, you had to go to church Sunday or go home. It was no question.
CJ was a praise dancer, and we went to church 3 times a week. We never missed church. Bible study, church on Saturdays and Sundays. It doesn't matter, but we was all there.
We would train, get the dance routines down and whatnot, and then on Sundays we would perform in front of everybody. And CJ became basically a big brother to me.
He was always trying to be somebody's savior, saving them from something, helping somebody, trying to make them feel good.
He would preach and not even realize that he's preaching. And then later you'd be like, that really helped me. He didn't even realize that he was doing it sometimes.
As popular as he was, Carter had dreams to leave North Toledo after high school.
Going to NFL, going pro. That was his thing. Like he was gonna make it too. He was probably one of the best football players I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen a lot of them.
He thought he would go to college and play football, but then when my daughter Kayana went to join the National Guards, he's like, "Daddy, I want to join the National Guards too." And I told him, "It's your choice. It's your choice. I support you. If you want to go play football, hey, we gonna go play football. If you want to go to the service, you go to the service."
He just wanted to do something big. He always gave that energy off that I want to do something big. I want to grow. I want to give back in any way I can.
But by November of his senior year, 17-year-old Carter is rushed to the hospital after being shot 3 times in the back in front of Chase Elementary School.
So by the time that any detectives arrived on scene, there were no witnesses other than the custodian inside the school.
This is a resident area. People called 911 when they heard the shots, but when detectives get there, no one's there. But then they realized that a janitor worked inside the school was working and Marlon heard the shots.
All we had was the custodian. So at that point, I asked the crew to take her downtown. We try to interview everybody at the police station so that we can have them on video and record their statements.
Now police, they got to start from scratch. They are knocking on doors. They're trying to see if they can find anybody. They're canvassing the whole area because they got to get some type of information because at this point, they have nothing. The recurring theme is that every neighbor they talked to pretty much said they heard the gunshots. They didn't see anything else.
They were not getting any information at all. So people in that neighborhood were being very tight-lipped.
Then, investigators locate the young woman who had been on the scene when first responders arrived.
There was a young lady that lived close, right across the street, and she had been out to the scene. As she's holding Carter, she called her mom and said, you know, Carter's been shot. And her mom called 911. So we were able to track her down.
They also asked for her to come to the station for an interview. Then, detectives get word on Carter's condition.
They did everything that they could, but he eventually succumbed to his injuries.
He had 3 gunshot wound injuries in his body. One was to the lower back, the other one was to the left back. The third gunshot wound hit him on the right buttock area, the right thigh. And that was just superficial. These bullets, they were devastating. The one to the lower back actually hit his heart and his left lung. He had no chance to survive these injuries.
"17-year-old Carter Coley Jr. has just been pronounced dead at a Toledo hospital after being shot 3 times on the city's north side."
News that Carter had been shot spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Before police could make any notifications, everyone already knew about it.
The scene at the emergency room at the hospital was chaotic. There were people everywhere wondering what had happened. Family members, kids, neighbors.
The bishop called first and said, get to the hospital. We go in, they put us in this little room, and all we're asking is, where's our son? We want to see our son.
They came out and said that he had passed away.
That was just like someone stuck a knife in my chest and just kept turning it and turning it and turning it. You know, just uncontrollable crying. You know, just how can this be? You know, he was just here and now he's gone.
Police was everywhere. And I kept saying, you know, can I see my son? Can I see my son? And they wouldn't let me see my son.
Talking about because of the DNA, we might get some DNA on him or something. Cops was trying to restrain my husband because he wanted to get back there and see his son. You don't want to see him right now. You can't see him. We can't let you see him. It's a homicide.
While Carter's family processes the shock, at the station, detectives interview the janitor who was inside the elementary school when the shooting took place.
The janitor gave us a description of the vehicles that she had seen drive out of the parking lot of the school and down Chase Street. One of them was a pickup truck, and she believed it to be a blue color. The other one was it looked like a 4-door sedan. She didn't have a color on that one. It was just a dark 4-door sedan. She didn't have any information on the occupants of the vehicle. She couldn't see anything like that. So we put that information out, and we had crews in the area looking for vehicles matching that description in that particular area.
Detectives interview the young woman who was holding Carter when paramedics arrived.
She was there trying to pick them out as he was injured very bad at the scene, but she fled as the police arrived, but she was easily located because she lived closely in the neighborhood.
She tells them she came outside when she saw a crowd gathering in the street. She recognized a lot of them as students from Woodward High School.
She could hear a fight from outside her house, so she went outside to see what was going on. She heard a loud commotion. It was 2 young men about to fight or beginning to fight. Then all of a sudden, a male ran from the alley wearing a ski mask. She heard several shots. And she just stood there, and everybody fled from the scene. Couldn't recognize anyone from the scene because everyone fled but her.
It was chaos. Kids were running everywhere. And there was Carter on the ground. 3 gunshots in the back.
She doesn't give them much information, but she do give them that there was a lot of people at the scene who saw the incident go down.
Investigators formulate a theory.
It wasn't just a random shooting of people out in the street.
Someone took the time to put on the mask and walked up to Carter and shot him 3 times and left the scene. He was the target, for sure.
Then, detectives learn of recent trouble at the school where Carter was a student.
We had our school security person. He was able to pull up some reports for us indicating that there had been an altercation at Woodward High School the day before. There was 5 boys.
They almost got to a fight at lunch. A situation where like they was looking at CJ wrong or something. Carter felt disrespected.
The kids were brought into the principal's office and they had spoken with the principal, but they hadn't decided what was going to happen to these boys yet at this time. And again, it's just threats. You know, they didn't start fighting.
Whatever happened in school, it wasn't resolved because Carter didn't go to school that day before he was shot.
Was Carter afraid? If so, why?
The detectives know that a lot of people saw the shooting and they need to come forward and give information. But this time, no one's coming forward to give them information, but they're looking for the people right now.
Then investigators learn that some of them may be at the hospital.
I was informed that there were some boys that had showed up to the hospital, and there was a crew there, and they wanted to know how Carter was doing.
So all of the kids who were witnesses to the shooting ran the minute they heard gunfire. And they were concerned about their friend Carter, so they went to the hospital to check on him to see how he was doing.
So they were detained and brought down to the station so that we could talk to them. These 3 boys were friends of Carter's, and they were all 4 together when they went to the scene in front of Chase Elementary. All 3 boys indicated that they saw the guy with the gun.
Toledo investigators interviewed 3 teenagers who showed up at a local hospital after their friend, Carter Coley Jr., was shot and killed in front of multiple witnesses.
There were 3 boys, and we interviewed them individually. And these 3 boys were friends of Carter's, and they were all together when they went to the scene in front of Chase Elementary.
They start with 19-year-old Matthew. He tells investigators that he and Carter had gone to Chase Elementary with their friend Darren and another friend, Nathan.
They went to school because Darren was supposed to fight a fellow classmate.
There was a dispute between one of Carter's friends and another boy over some social media content where one of the boys felt that his sister had been disrespected by one of Carter's friends. So Carter's friend and this other boy that lives right there across from Chase Elementary, they decided to have a little fight.
They were going to fight one-on-one. However, he did bring back up just in case, and that's where all the chaos really started.
And next thing you know, all four of them are riding together in a car going over to this area. And they park down the street. As they're walking down the block, they see a car with its headlights on in the parking lot of Chase Elementary, and the car blew its horn, and they heard somebody say, "They're here."
Word of the fight blew up on social media. This explains why the janitor saw certain vehicles. They were not suspects, it was only spectators.
He's bouncing around in the street, got his fists up. "Come on, let's go at it. You disrespected my sister." And the two of them are bouncing around with their fists up, just like Muhammad Ali, nobody's throwing a punch. And the small crowd are like, "Come on, is somebody gonna do something?"
According to Matthew, something did happen, but it wasn't a fight.
3 people came out of a alleyway, and these 3 guys come up, and the 2 of them have hoods up that are tied tight, and the third one has a face mask on that covers his mouth and a hat on, but his eyes and some of his hair is visible. And he comes out and he's holding a gun. And he says, "You guys were stupid to come, especially you, Carter." And then he pointed the gun at Carter. And as he pointed the gun at Carter, everybody took off running, including Carter. They heard a gunshot, and Carter grabbed his leg and went down. And they heard 2 more gunshots as they continued running down the street. 2 of them ran in one direction, another one ran in another, and they ended up, 2 of them hid underneath a porch. And they met up with their third friend. They made it to their car, and that's when they drove and went to the hospital to check on Carter to see how he was doing.
Then, Matthew drops a bomb.
He said that the shooter was Shanta Jones. He played football with Shanta for years, and he knows him well. He knows his voice and how he walks and talks, so he knew for sure that this was the shooter. He knew this was Shanta for sure because Shanta wore dreadlocks, and he could see the dreadlocks from under the mask that he was wearing.
Darren tells the same story.
He thought he was gonna be fighting one-on-one, just him, mano-a-mano. But then he found out there were texts and calls going out to everybody about this fight. As he gets there, he notices the streets are lined with people ready to see a fight. 3 men came from around the corner, and they had masks on and hoodies tied up tight, and they were brandishing guns. At this point, all hell breaks loose.
He knew Shanta since the 7th grade. He knew that he wore dreads, and he could see the dreads from under his mask. So he knew for sure, definitely, that this was him. He was the shooter.
The third young man, Nathan, says the same thing.
The one that had the gun, they could see his eyes, they recognized his face, and they could see that there were particular style of dreads hanging down. And they all knew that it was Shante Jones. I asked each one of the boys, "How well do you know Shante?" Because they were all so certain that the voice that they heard, the stature of the person that came out with the gun, and the dreads in particular. They said, I could see his dreads, and I know his voice. They said that they had played football together, they played basketball together, they shared lockers together, so they're in the locker room with each other. They see each other every day. They're going through practice. They see each other's movements. They know their body styles. They know everything about each other, especially for as long as they knew each other. This wasn't just a random act and a stranger involved. These were well-known friends.
After teenage football star Carter Coley Jr. was shot to death in the street, 3 witnesses point to 17-year-old Shanta Jones as the shooter. But detectives are left with questions.
Carter and Shante have been best friends for years. So why did Shante want to shoot and hurt Carter.
And how did the fight between Darren and another student turn into a masked man gunning Carter down?
It wasn't about Carter. Carter was just there for backup for his friend to make sure that it was a fair fight.
This cannot be a coincidence, because he knew that Carter would be there for backup for his friend, so he assumed that he was coming. So this was basically a sit-up.
Word was out that they were going to fight, so Carter was coming. Therefore, somebody went over there to shoot Carter.
The investigators found out that this was supposed to be just a fight, but it turned into a shooting. So now they had to find the people from the scene to make sure these three people was telling the truth to back up these guys' story. So this time they're looking for the other witnesses.
Detectives locate one of the drivers.
But this one witness heard all three shots.
There was a shot directly to Carter, and as Carter was falling, he shot him again. So that's 2 times, and then he walked up again, pow, one more shot directly at Carter.
The witness's description confirms what investigators suspected.
Carter was the target. He was the only target.
And when they speak to Carter's classmates at Woodward High, detectives discover a potential motive.
We learned through several interviews that Carter and Shantae shared a locker when they played football in the fall. And this is mid-November. And in the middle of October, there was amount of cash that had come missing out of the locker that Carter shared with Shantae. Now we've got a couple people saying that it's $600. We had one person say it was $700. They had been arguing over the money since it came up missing. So Shantae and Carter had kind of had a falling out.
One day in the cafeteria, it almost came out to a head. That day, Carter and Shantae was about to have a fight, but it was broken up.
But even after that, the tension continued to build.
Carter had received a message from a girl from school who had heard about all this going on, and she was fearful for Carter's safety, and she told him, Carter, don't come to school tomorrow because, they're talking about hurting you. So he did not go to school on the 14th. He stayed home. Motive matters. If we can come up with a motive, that adds to our case. In this case, we did come up with a motive. There were altercations occurring prior to the incident at school. They were arguing, Shantae and Carter. So there was the money that was taken was basically the motive for this incident.
This was not an accident. This was not a coincidence. This was payback.
Motive combined with the eyewitness statements gives detectives what they need.
When I talked to the prosecutor and gave her all the evidence that we had obtained up to that point, she felt that it was enough to charge Shantae with murder, and that's the avenue that we took.
But Shanta is MIA.
The police are searching for Shantae Jones, and they can't find him. He's not in town. So they contact his mother, and they find out that he is at his mother's house. So they tell her what happened, and they ask her to bring him back to Toledo. So she does. She brings him back to the Toledo Police Department.
He didn't seem scared. He didn't seem like he was overly upset. He was not hard, on the other hand, either. He didn't seem hardcore. He was a 17-year-old, student who came in and it seemed like he didn't want to implicate himself in any way. We read him his Miranda rights. He invoked his rights to remain silent. So at that point, he was charged and booked at 17 years old into the juvenile justice system.
Investigators in Toledo, Ohio, have just arrested 17-year-old Shanta Jones. Shanta is accused of gunning down his close friend and teammate, Carter Coley Jr.
Carter and Shanta was best friends until this money situation came about. For many years, they've been best friends, played ball together, but it's hard to believe all of a sudden they're no longer best friends. It had to be more to the story.
Speaking with the family, I learned that Carter was a great kid. He was a good student. He played a couple of sports. He was great at football. In fact, he was being recruited to college. He had a great future. Mrs. Coley loved Shantae and took him into her own home. There was never any indication that anything like this would ever happen.
My mind went to some places, believe me, but that's not me. We had people come up to us, oh, we can take care of this. Do you want us to, I said, no, because then that makes us them, and we're not them. We don't do that. There was a lot of people that really wanted to retaliate, and we had to say, please don't. It's not right. We can't do that. And I'm glad I said that, because my integrity's at stake too. I just never seen him that way. I never looked at Shanta like anything was wrong with him or he was a bad person. He was always very sweet to us when he stayed with us. He was a good kid.
Carter's mother knew there had been tension at school. In fact, she encouraged him to stay home on the day he was murdered.
They tried to jump him, and then when I told him not to go to school Friday, I said, I don't trust them. I just feel like they was gonna do something to him at school. I just thought, I'm keeping him home. I'm gonna keep him safe. I said, I don't want you going to school. He said, oh, Mama, they ain't gonna do nothing. They're just punks. Okay, you're not going to school. So he stayed home, and we went and we got some Chinese food. We went over to Kayana's house, his sister, across the street, and we all ate together. Every time he used to leave the house, I used to say, CJ, be careful out there. I can't replace you. You cannot be replaced, and he knew how I felt.
Carter's dad reveals that he knew about the missing money because Shanta's uncle called him.
I got a call from the uncle. Me and him got to talking, and we discussed it. I told him, hey, man, I'll take care, I'll give you your money back. And that's when he said, no, don't worry about it. He didn't tell me how much it was, but he just told me that they was going to squash it, just forget about it, and that his nephew was going to fix everything. And when he said, don't worry about it, I didn't worry about it no more.
But detectives learned there's a rumor the uncle was concerned over the money because it was his.
During our interviews, we learned that this money that was taken was actually money that was obtained by the sale of drugs. And the drugs that had been sold belonged to Shantae's uncle. So Shantae was selling drugs for his uncle, and it was his uncle's, technically, money that was stolen.
Shantae also didn't really have a stable home environment. He was bouncing from family member to family member.
Even though this was a small amount of money, the disrespect that it showed would make him look weak, and that he could not stand for. This was never about the money. This was about the disrespect.
The theory is that Shanta was in charge of the money. Now he got to fix it. He got people to answer to. So now he got to retaliate and get the money back.
As investigators try to bolster the case ahead of the trial, they re-interview the witnesses. But this time, when they speak with Matthew, he has a different story to tell.
Matthew is now saying he's not sure who the shooter was. He was going as good that it was Shanta. But now he is saying 1% he cannot be sure that it was him at this time. Investigators at this time don't know what he's talking about. They wonder, is he scared? Does he not want to testify now? Or is he telling the truth?
Prosecutors prepare to try 17-year-old Shanta Jones in the shooting death of his football teammate and one of his closest friends, Carter Coley Jr.
Because Shante was 17 years old, the prosecutor wanted to have him certified as an adult. So we had a trial and a hearing, and I testified. There were other people that testified what happened. And then it was up to the judge to decide whether Shante should be certified as an adult and charged as such. And the judge came back with a ruling that yes, he was certifiable, and they did certify him as an adult. So then he was charged in the Lucas County Common Pleas Court for murder.
This case is not a slam dunk. It's based on witnesses' testimony, but now the witnesses are having second thoughts. Matthew is now saying that he is not positive that Shante is the shooter.
When you go to court, I don't care how much evidence you got. It's a possibility the person could be found not guilty.
I don't believe we had any evidence other than the clothing that was removed from Carter by the fire department. There was no gun, there was no shell casings. We didn't recover a bullet on the street.
But Shante is also having doubts.
So after Shante is arrested and he is sent to jail on November 17th, 2014, now they have to figure out what his plan is for getting through the upcoming trial. He could plead guilty, he could plead not guilty, and there are different paths that go from that point forward.
You never know what the jury's going to say. It's a risk.
When it's time for Shante to plead in court, he presents an Alford plea, which is where he will plead guilty in a criminal court, but he can maintain his innocence.
An Alford plea is you're not admitting guilt, but you're not denying the facts as stated by the prosecution. So you're not denying what's being said, but you're not admitting to it either.
Shante Jones pled no contest for involuntary manslaughter and received 10 years with an additional 3 years for the use of a gun in the commission of the crime.
Carter's family supports the deal.
Shante was still young enough to come out and do something with his life, and that's what I hope he does. He's supposed to be released, I think, in 27, and I hope that he comes out, and I hope that he cleans up his life, and he's able to clean up his life, you know, and make something of it, because he's still got to live in the world, you know, and I don't wish him no bad luck, you know, I don't. I really don't. I would like to see him, you know, do well, you know, and make CJ's death not about, you know, him.
In fact, they have mixed feelings about whether Shante should be behind bars at all.
Deep in my heart, I didn't really feel that he did it. And, you know, like, how could he? I don't know, I could be wrong. You know, people can tell you what they want to tell you and make it sound sweet and good, but you just never know, you know, but I just went with my instinct.
When Shai was in jail, I spoke to him. He called us. He said, Coach Carter, I didn't do it. And I was like, Shante, I know you didn't do it.
Whether Carter's death was an act of betrayal or a cold-hearted case of revenge, his absence still looms heavy.
He was just amazing. Everything he did, football, all that. Being there for people, all of it, like, real genuine person.
It made me look at people differently. We were so close. Like I said, that football team was really a family. We did everything together. Get food, you know what I'm saying, just spend time as a team together.
October 2002 arrived with the kind of weather that makes people believe the hardest part of the year is already behind them. Summer had finally loosened its grip over Washington, D.C., and the surrounding suburbs. The heavy humidity had faded into crisp mornings and cool evenings. Trees lining quiet residential streets had begun to exchange their deep green leaves for shades of amber, crimson, and gold. Parents packed lunches while children hurried toward school buses. Office workers carried paper cups of coffee across parking lots without paying attention to the strangers passing beside them. Gas stations filled with commuters preparing for another ordinary day. Shopping centers echoed with the familiar rhythm of shopping carts, distant conversations, and car doors closing one after another. Life moved with the confidence of routine because routine is what convinces people that tomorrow will probably look like today. No one knew that somewhere nearby, hidden behind ordinary traffic and familiar highways, someone had already decided otherwise. Fear rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with sirens or explosions. Sometimes it begins with a sound so small that nobody recognizes it for what it is. A single crack. Brief enough to disappear into the noise of a busy morning. A sound mistaken for construction equipment, a truck backfiring, or a firecracker left over from a forgotten celebration. Then someone falls. The people standing nearby do not scream immediately. They stare. They hesitate. A man who had been walking only seconds earlier is suddenly lying motionless on the pavement. Someone rushes forward believing it is a heart attack. Another searches for blood but cannot understand why there is almost none. There is confusion before there is panic. Questions before answers. By the time anyone realizes a bullet has crossed hundreds of feet in complete silence, the person who fired it is already gone. There is no masked gunman running into an alley. No speeding getaway car tearing away from the scene. No eyewitness pointing toward a suspect. Only a body. Only silence. And an invisible pair of eyes watching from somewhere no one thinks to look. Over the next several weeks, that silence would become more terrifying than any scream. Imagine stepping out of your car to fill the gas tank before work. The morning feels completely ordinary. Your thoughts are occupied by bills, appointments, children waiting at home, groceries that need to be bought after work, perhaps an upcoming birthday or weekend plans. You swipe your credit card, remove the fuel nozzle, and glance at the numbers climbing on the pump. Around you, dozens of strangers are doing exactly the same thing. Nothing feels dangerous. Nothing appears unusual. Then, without warning, someone several hundred feet away gently squeezes a trigger. You never hear the bullet. The people around you hear only a sharp crack that seems impossibly far away. By the time anyone understands what happened, another life has ended. Now imagine standing outside a grocery store. Or crossing a parking lot. Or cutting the grass in your own front yard. Or walking into school carrying a backpack. Every open space becomes a question. Every parking lot becomes exposed ground. Every trip outside your front door becomes an act of faith. That was the world the Beltway snipers created. Not through explosions. Not through dramatic hostage situations. Not through demands broadcast on television during the first days. Instead, they built terror one carefully aimed bullet at a time. The attacks appeared random because they were designed to feel random. There was no obvious pattern that ordinary people could understand. The victims were different ages, different occupations, different races, different lifestyles. They did not know one another. They had not crossed paths with dangerous criminals. They had not received threats. They had simply gone about their daily routines. And then those routines ended forever. As investigators rushed from one crime scene to another, an invisible enemy continued moving freely through one of the most heavily monitored metropolitan regions in the United States. Hundreds of police officers searched neighborhoods. Helicopters circled overhead. Roadblocks appeared across highways. Patrol cars filled intersections. Yet each new attack seemed to mock every effort. The killer was always somewhere else. Or perhaps, terrifyingly, somewhere very close. Every eyewitness believed they had seen something important. Some described a white delivery truck speeding away. Others remembered a white van. A few insisted they had seen a dark sedan leaving the area. Tips flooded emergency phone lines faster than detectives could examine them. Every report sounded believable because every frightened witness desperately wanted to help. The problem was that fear changes memory. People remember movement. They remember colors. They remember the vehicle that caught their attention after the gunshot, not necessarily before it. And while thousands of innocent drivers became subjects of police scrutiny, the real killers continued slipping unnoticed through ordinary traffic, blending into the endless flow of commuters that circled the Capital Beltway every single day. That was perhaps the cruelest part of the nightmare. The murder weapon did not need darkness. It did not need deserted streets. It did not even need privacy. It worked in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses who never saw the shooter. Every successful attack deepened a terrifying realization. The sniper was not hunting people because of who they were. He was hunting them because they happened to be there. That understanding changed human behavior almost overnight. Parents who once encouraged children to play outside began keeping them indoors. School administrators debated whether recess itself had become too dangerous. Gas stations, once places people visited without a second thought, suddenly felt exposed. Drivers crouched beside their vehicles while pumping gasoline, hoping a lower profile might somehow make them invisible. Some zigzagged between their cars and the store entrance after hearing advice passed from neighbor to neighbor. No one knew whether it actually helped. It probably did not. But people needed to believe they could do something. Anything. Because the alternative was admitting that survival might depend entirely on chance. Television stations interrupted regular programming with breaking updates so frequently that viewers stopped expecting good news. Maps filled with red markers spread across the region, each one representing another shooting, another investigation, another grieving family trying to understand why someone they loved had become part of a growing pattern no one could explain. News anchors repeated the same questions every night. Who is responsible? Where will they strike next? How do you protect yourself from someone you cannot see? No one had satisfying answers. Behind every front door, ordinary conversations quietly changed. Call me when you get there. Don't stop unless you have to. Stay inside. Hurry home. Simple sentences became daily rituals. People checked parking lots before stepping out of their cars. They scanned rooftops, tree lines, office buildings, highway overpasses. Places they had ignored their entire lives suddenly seemed filled with invisible danger. Every distant noise caused heads to turn. Every unfamiliar vehicle attracted suspicious glances. The entire region had begun looking over its shoulder. Somewhere within that growing fear, two individuals continued driving roads that millions of others considered completely ordinary. One was a 41-year-old man whose past was already filled with violence, control, and resentment. The other was a 17-year-old teenager whose life had become deeply entangled with the older man's influence. Together, inside a seemingly unremarkable Chevrolet Caprice, they carried not only a rifle capable of reaching victims from extraordinary distances, but a plan that law enforcement had not yet begun to fully understand. Before investigators would uncover the truth, before fingerprints, ballistics, intercepted phone calls, and one overlooked connection would finally begin pulling the mystery apart. The Washington metropolitan area would endure weeks of uncertainty unlike anything it had experienced in modern history. Because the most frightening monsters are not always the ones hiding in darkness. Sometimes they are already parked in the car beside you, waiting for the traffic light to turn green. The first days of October should have belonged to ordinary memories. Children comparing Halloween costumes before school. Neighbors discussing the first cool morning of the season while collecting newspapers from their driveways. Couples planning weekend trips to see the changing leaves in the mountains. Football games filled television screens, and shopping centers began decorating storefronts with orange pumpkins and paper ghosts. It was the season Americans often described as comfortable, predictable, familiar. The air carried the scent of damp leaves instead of summer heat, and daylight slowly surrendered a little earlier each evening. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested that history was about to remember those autumn weeks for something entirely different. At first, the killings looked isolated. One victim collapsed. Then another. Then another. Each attack seemed impossible to connect with the last because they occurred in places that shared almost nothing except their unbearable ordinariness. A grocery store parking lot. A sidewalk. A gas station. A suburban street. Places where people never imagined becoming targets. Places without obvious escape routes for a gunman. Places where witnesses stood only yards away, yet somehow saw nothing. Every new shooting left investigators standing over another crime scene that appeared almost untouched. No signs of struggle. No shell casings scattered nearby. No weapon abandoned in haste. No frantic witness describing a man with a rifle running away. The violence itself lasted less than a second. Everything afterward lasted forever. Detectives measured distances with careful precision. Crime scene photographers documented every inch of pavement. Forensic specialists searched for fragments invisible to the naked eye. Uniformed officers pushed back growing crowds as flashing emergency lights reflected against storefront windows and parked vehicles. Families arrived hoping there had been some mistake. Perhaps it was someone else. Perhaps the injured person would survive. Perhaps the phone call they had received was wrong. Hope often survives longer than logic. It survives until a doctor removes a pair of gloves. Until an officer lowers his voice. Until someone asks for dental records instead of identification. Behind every yellow strip of crime scene tape stood people whose lives had just divided into two separate timelines. Before. After. The victims had no opportunity to defend themselves because they never knew they were in danger. There was no confrontation, no argument, no warning. Most never even saw the direction from which death arrived. Their final moments remained painfully ordinary. A wallet being returned to a pocket. A shopping bag lifted into the trunk of a car. A lawn mower pushed across freshly cut grass. Hands reaching for a gas pump. The simplicity of those moments made the horror almost impossible to comprehend. People expect danger to announce itself. A robbery. An assault. Someone shouting. Footsteps running. Instead, the sniper erased that expectation completely. Safety no longer depended on avoiding dangerous neighborhoods or walking with friends after dark. The attacks ignored those unwritten rules everyone believed they understood. Daylight offered no protection. Crowded places offered no protection. Affluent suburbs offered no protection. Normal life itself had become vulnerable. Across Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, routines quietly began changing. Some businesses noticed customers lingering indoors longer than usual before walking to their cars. Office workers started traveling in groups across parking lots even though nobody could explain exactly why. Parents volunteered to escort children into school buildings rather than watching them disappear from the curb. Coaches cancelled outdoor practices. Teachers glanced nervously through classroom windows whenever students asked to go outside. Fear spread faster than facts. Rumors became their own epidemic. Someone claimed the sniper always targeted blonde people. Someone else insisted only gas stations were dangerous. Others believed the shootings happened only during certain hours of the day. Every theory offered temporary comfort because every theory implied rules. If there were rules, perhaps people could avoid becoming victims. The terrifying reality was that investigators themselves had not discovered any. Every morning carried the possibility that another shooting would shatter whatever assumptions had formed the day before. Inside police command centers, maps gradually transformed into unsettling mosaics of colored pins and handwritten notes. Detectives traced highways connecting crime scenes. Analysts compared weather conditions, times of day, traffic patterns, and ballistic evidence. Federal agencies joined local departments. Jurisdictions that normally handled their own investigations suddenly found themselves sharing information around the clock. The challenge was unprecedented. Each crime scene produced evidence. But evidence without context is merely a collection of unanswered questions. The bullet recovered from one victim matched another. That much became clear. The same rifle. The same caliber. The same invisible hand. Yet knowing the attacks were connected solved only one mystery while creating countless others. Who was choosing these victims? Why these locations? Why leave no witnesses? How was the shooter escaping so quickly every single time? The possibility that investigators faced an experienced military sniper circulated almost immediately. It seemed like the only logical explanation. The accuracy required remarkable skill. The patience suggested discipline. The ability to disappear hinted at meticulous planning. But assumptions can become dangerous companions during an investigation. The more authorities searched for someone fitting one profile, the easier it became to overlook possibilities that appeared less obvious. Meanwhile, television helicopters hovered above fresh crime scenes almost before detectives completed their first interviews. Satellite trucks crowded nearby intersections. Reporters stood beneath bright camera lights describing events that remained frustratingly unclear. Millions of viewers watched every evening, hoping certainty would finally replace speculation. Instead, uncertainty grew. Each news broadcast replayed nearly identical images. Police vehicles. Yellow tape. An empty parking space where someone had stood only moments earlier. A blanket shielding a body from public view. Neighbors speaking softly into microphones. Investigators refusing to answer questions they themselves could not yet answer. The repetition became hypnotic. Another shooting. Another investigation. Another victim. Another promise that law enforcement was pursuing every lead. The cycle repeated until many residents began measuring time not by weekdays but by attacks. People no longer asked whether another shooting would happen. They wondered where. And who. Some families quietly left town to stay with relatives elsewhere. Hotel reservations increased outside the metropolitan area. Others had no choice but to continue working because mortgages, rent, and everyday responsibilities do not pause for fear. Nurses still reported for overnight shifts. Delivery drivers still completed their routes. Mechanics still repaired cars. Teachers still unlocked classrooms before sunrise. Life insisted on moving forward. Fear simply rode beside it. Unknown to nearly everyone following the story, the individuals responsible for this expanding nightmare were watching the reaction with extraordinary interest. They followed media coverage. They observed police deployments. They listened as experts offered theories that often missed the truth entirely. Every incorrect assumption became another layer of protection. Every mistaken vehicle description bought them more time. Every hour without identification reinforced a dangerous confidence that they remained untouchable. The weapon itself represented only part of their advantage. Their greatest weapon was invisibility. Not literal invisibility. Psychological invisibility. The ability to appear so ordinary that no one looked twice. Traffic flowed around them every day. Families stopped beside them at intersections. Police cruisers passed them traveling in the opposite direction. No alarms sounded. No one pointed. No one recognized the vehicle quietly carrying one of the most wanted killers in America. Somewhere beyond the headlines and emergency briefings, two separate stories were slowly moving toward each other. One belonged to investigators chasing fragments of evidence scattered across multiple states. The other belonged to two men whose partnership had evolved into something far darker than almost anyone could imagine. One story was driven by relentless determination. The other by calculation, manipulation, and a willingness to reduce complete strangers to nothing more than targets viewed through a rifle scope. Neither side yet understood how close or how far they truly were from the end. For the families already grieving, every unanswered question deepened the wound. They searched television broadcasts for information the way others searched for hope. Every official press conference raised expectations that an arrest might finally come. Every announcement that the investigation was continuing felt like another reminder that the person responsible remained free. And somewhere beyond the reach of every police perimeter, hidden in plain sight among millions of commuters traveling the highways circling the nation's capital, the next victim had not yet realized that an ordinary errand was about to become the final moment of an ordinary life. There is a particular kind of fear that changes a city without leaving a single visible scar. Buildings remain standing. Streets remain crowded. Traffic lights continue cycling from red to green. Restaurants open their doors every morning, schools ring their bells, and office towers fill with workers carrying briefcases and coffee cups. From a distance, everything appears exactly as it should. But look a little closer, and the change becomes impossible to ignore. People move faster across open spaces. Conversations become shorter. Eyes drift upward toward rooftops and tree lines without conscious thought. Every parking lot suddenly feels much larger than it did a week before. The Washington metropolitan area had entered a season where ordinary life and constant anxiety existed side by side. No one knew where the sniper would appear next because there was no obvious reason behind the killings. Terrorism usually came with demands. Revenge usually pointed toward a personal history. Organized crime followed patterns that investigators could eventually recognize. But these shootings seemed to reject every familiar category. The victims shared no profession, no neighborhood, no relationship, no common routine beyond the simple fact that they had stepped outside. That uncertainty was devastating. The human mind searches for order even in tragedy. We instinctively ask what the victims had in common because we hope the answer will reveal something we ourselves can avoid. If they were targeted because of where they worked, we tell ourselves we are safe elsewhere. If they were chosen because of someone they knew, we find comfort in believing our own lives are different. But what happens when the only thing connecting the victims is chance? What happens when anyone can become the next headline? That question settled over the region like an invisible fog. Morning commutes became silent. Radio hosts no longer joked about traffic delays without eventually mentioning another shooting, another police briefing, another plea for public assistance. Newspapers that had once devoted their front pages to politics and international affairs now carried photographs of crime scenes, maps marked with shooting locations, and updates that millions of readers studied over breakfast. Parents unfolded those papers while pretending not to let their children see the fear behind their eyes. Because children notice more than adults often realize. They noticed when recess was shortened. They noticed teachers repeatedly looking through classroom windows. They noticed parents insisting they run directly from the school entrance to the family car without stopping to talk with friends. Questions became difficult to answer. Why can't we play outside? Why is everyone scared? Who is the sniper? Adults struggled because the truth sounded unbelievable even as it unfolded in real time. They didn't know. The police didn't know. No one knew. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the television cameras and police roadblocks, John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo continued traveling through the same communities that now feared them. They drove roads crowded with commuters, stopped where countless other motorists stopped, and blended into a landscape built upon anonymity. Their greatest protection was not speed or sophisticated technology. It was the simple fact that they looked like two ordinary people inside an ordinary car. The Chevrolet Caprice did not demand attention. It disappeared into traffic the way countless aging sedans did every day. Inside that vehicle, however, ordinary appearances concealed extraordinary preparation. Investigators would later discover how methodically the car had been altered. A small firing port had been created near the rear license plate, allowing shots to be fired from inside the trunk while hiding the shooter's position from anyone nearby. It transformed a common sedan into a concealed firing platform, one designed to make witnesses search in the wrong direction while the attackers quietly drove away. It was a chilling reminder that the most dangerous threats are not always the loudest or the most obvious. Sometimes they are engineered to remain unnoticed until the damage has already been done. Yet even as the attacks unfolded, another story was quietly taking shape beneath the surface, one far more complicated than the nightly news could capture. Who was John Allen Muhammad before he became one of America's most feared fugitives? How did a decorated military veteran descend into a path that ended with innocent strangers dying in parking lots? And how did a 17-year-old named Lee Boyd Malvo become inseparable from a man more than twice his age, following him across states and ultimately into one of the most notorious crime sprees in modern American history? Those questions would eventually force investigators, psychologists, prosecutors, and the public to confront uncomfortable truths about manipulation, control, and the devastating consequences of unchecked violence. But in October 2002, none of those answers existed. There were only fragments. A rifle. A handful of bullets. A trail of shattered families. Every passing day increased the pressure on law enforcement. Local police departments, state investigators, federal agents, forensic specialists, behavioral analysts, and intelligence officers worked around the clock, sharing information across jurisdictions in ways that had rarely been attempted before. The investigation was becoming as vast as the fear itself. Every lead had to be examined, every witness interviewed, every tip evaluated, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Thousands of calls poured into hotlines. Most led nowhere. Some consumed valuable hours. A few appeared promising before collapsing under closer examination. Still, investigators continued because somewhere within that overwhelming flood of information, the truth was waiting. The sniper had made one mistake. Perhaps not yet. Perhaps not one anyone recognized. But every criminal, no matter how disciplined, eventually leaves behind something, a decision, a pattern, a careless moment, a connection that only becomes visible when enough pieces are placed together. The challenge was surviving long enough to find it. For the victims' families, that breakthrough could never arrive quickly enough. Every arrest that failed to materialize meant another empty chair at the dinner table, another funeral, another child asking why a parent was never coming home. Their grief unfolded away from television cameras, in living rooms filled with photographs and unanswered questions. Birthdays would still arrive. Holidays would still come and go. Time would continue moving forward, indifferent to the lives that had been interrupted in an instant. Long after the flashing lights disappeared from each crime scene, those families would continue living with the silence left behind. That silence deserves to be remembered just as much as the headlines. Because this story is not only about two men who spread fear across an entire region. It is about the people whose ordinary mornings never reached the afternoon. It is about investigators chasing a shadow that seemed impossible to catch. It is about a city forced to question whether simple routines could ever feel safe again. And it is about how one of the most complex manhunts in American history slowly uncovered a truth that was stranger, darker, and more calculated than almost anyone had imagined. This is the story of the D.C. Beltway snipers. Not as a collection of dates and crime scene reports, but as a journey through fear, obsession, manipulation, loss, and justice. Over the chapters ahead, we will follow the lives forever altered by those 22 days in October, trace the investigation from its earliest dead ends to its decisive breakthroughs, and examine the minds behind crimes that changed the way America understood mobile sniper attacks forever. Because before the arrests, before the courtroom verdicts, before the names John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo became known around the world, there was only a single gunshot on an ordinary autumn morning and a question that no one could answer. Where did it come from? The Washington metropolitan area has always existed as two different worlds at the same time. One is the world that appears on television screens across the globe, a city of marble monuments, presidential motorcades, historic landmarks, and decisions that shape international politics. Visitors arrive expecting to see the White House gleaming beneath the afternoon sun, the Capitol rising above the skyline, and the quiet dignity of memorials standing beside the reflecting pools. It is a place associated with power, ceremony, and history. The other Washington exists just beyond the postcards. It is a sprawling network of neighborhoods, suburban communities, shopping centers, office parks, gas stations, schools, apartment complexes, and highways that stretch across Maryland and Northern Virginia. Hundreds of thousands of people wake before sunrise every weekday, joining an endless stream of commuters circling Interstate 495, the Capitol Beltway, from which the sniper case would later take its infamous name. For the people who lived there, the monuments were simply part of the background. Life revolved around something far less glamorous. Morning traffic. School schedules. Mortgage payments. Youth soccer games. Weekend grocery shopping. Waiting in line for coffee before work. Parents kissed their children goodbye at front doors that looked almost identical from one neighborhood to the next. Lawn sprinklers clicked rhythmically across perfectly trimmed grass. School buses stopped every few blocks, collecting children still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Delivery trucks navigated quiet residential streets while radio stations discussed weather forecasts, sports scores, and the usual frustrations of Beltway traffic. It was the kind of routine millions of Americans recognized instantly because it reflected their own. There was comfort in that predictability. You knew which gas station usually had the lowest prices. You knew which grocery store was less crowded on weekday evenings. You knew the shortcut that saved 5 minutes during rush hour. Life became a collection of habits repeated so often that they no longer required thought. People unlocked their cars without looking around. They crossed parking lots while reading shopping lists. They stood beside gasoline pumps with their backs turned toward open roads. Security was not something they consciously felt. It was something they simply assumed. The attacks would shatter that assumption. In the autumn of 2002, the Washington region was home to an extraordinarily diverse population. Federal employees shared neighborhoods with mechanics, nurses, military families, teachers, restaurant workers, immigrants beginning new lives, retirees enjoying quieter years, and students dreaming about futures that seemed limitless. Every culture, every language, every profession could be found within a relatively short drive. It was a place where strangers crossed paths constantly without ever truly seeing one another. That anonymity usually represented freedom. Instead, it would become the perfect hiding place. October itself carried a unique atmosphere. Summer tourists had largely disappeared, leaving museums and monuments to a steadier rhythm of local visitors and school groups. Trees surrounding suburban neighborhoods had begun displaying brilliant autumn colors, transforming ordinary streets into tunnels of orange and gold. The mornings arrived with a crisp chill that encouraged jackets but not heavy coats. The afternoons remained warm enough for children to play outside until sunset. Halloween decorations appeared almost overnight. Plastic skeletons hung from front porches. Jack-o'-lanterns waited on doorsteps. Artificial spiderwebs stretched across bushes. The season celebrated harmless scares, the kind families laughed about together. No one imagined that genuine fear would soon replace those decorations. Looking back today, photographs from September 2002 carry an almost painful innocence. Birthday parties, school pictures, family barbecues, youth football games, weddings, neighborhood gatherings. Faces frozen in moments untouched by what was coming. People smiled because there was every reason to believe life would continue exactly as it always had. History often works that way. Its turning points rarely announce themselves. The days before a tragedy almost always appear ordinary. That ordinary world began to fracture on the morning of October 2nd. But to understand why those shootings produced such overwhelming terror, it is important to understand what investigators faced from the very beginning. This was not a single crime scene. It was not one neighborhood under siege. The attacks unfolded across multiple jurisdictions, each with its own police departments, investigative procedures, emergency communications, and leadership structures. Montgomery County detectives pursued one lead while officers in Prince George's County investigated another. Virginia agencies examined separate evidence. Federal authorities became increasingly involved as the scope of the crisis expanded. Each department possessed pieces of the puzzle. No one possessed the entire picture. That challenge may seem obvious today, in an era of instant information sharing and sophisticated digital databases. In 2002, however, coordination between numerous agencies was far more complicated. Detectives relied on phone calls, meetings, shared reports, and rapidly evolving communication systems while simultaneously responding to fresh attacks. Every minute mattered. Every delay risked another life. At first, even the public struggled to grasp what was happening. News reports described isolated shootings. Then another. Then another. Residents naturally assumed they were unrelated incidents because random murders committed by a hidden sniper seemed almost impossible to believe. People searched for familiar explanations. Perhaps it had been a robbery. Perhaps an argument had escalated. Perhaps gang violence. Those explanations made sense because they belonged to a world people already understood. The reality belonged to something else entirely. As investigators quietly compared forensic evidence, an unsettling possibility began emerging. The same rifle. The same caliber. The same precision. The same inexplicable absence of witnesses who had actually seen a shooter. Suddenly, isolated tragedies no longer appeared isolated. They appeared connected. That realization changed everything. Once authorities believed a serial sniper might be operating across the metropolitan area, every report of suspicious activity became significant. Patrol officers received updated briefings before each shift. Tactical units prepared for scenarios they had never expected to confront outside military operations. Detectives found themselves studying maps instead of suspects, searching for geographical patterns that refused to reveal themselves. The unknown became the investigation's greatest enemy. Known criminals can be tracked through associates, financial records, previous arrests, and personal rivalries. An unknown offender offers none of those advantages. Investigators were chasing someone who existed only through the damage left behind. Meanwhile, beyond police headquarters and command centers, life continued because it had to. Children still needed to reach school. Hospitals still treated patients. Businesses still opened every morning. Construction workers still climbed scaffolding before sunrise. Landscapers still trimmed hedges outside office buildings. Postal workers still walked neighborhood sidewalks carrying bags filled with letters. The remarkable thing about ordinary life is its persistence. Even in moments of extraordinary fear, people continue performing ordinary tasks because they have no alternative. Bills must be paid. Food must be purchased. Families must be cared for. Yet every one of those ordinary activities now carried an uncomfortable question. Was today the day routine would end? That uncertainty settled invisibly over every parking lot, every sidewalk, every gas station canopy. Residents developed small rituals without consciously deciding to do so. They parked closer to building entrances whenever possible. They hurried between stores instead of browsing outside. They glanced toward nearby tree lines before stepping into open spaces. Some laughed nervously about their new habits, hoping humor might diminish the anxiety. It never did. Because fear does not require constant visibility. It only requires possibility. As October progressed, possibility transformed into expectation. People expected another shooting. They simply did not know where. Some imagined the sniper hidden atop buildings like scenes from Hollywood thrillers. Others suspected wooded areas overlooking highways. Every elevated position attracted suspicious attention. Every parked vehicle lingering too long invited nervous glances. In reality, the truth was both simpler and more disturbing than almost anyone imagined. The threat was not hiding above the community. It was moving quietly through it. And before investigators could begin understanding the minds responsible for that decision, another question demanded attention. Who were the people whose lives had been stolen without warning, and how would their stories reveal the true human cost behind a case that much of the world remembered only as the hunt for two snipers? Every major criminal case eventually becomes defined by a handful of familiar images. In the years that followed the Beltway sniper attacks, those images would include police cruisers surrounding parking lots, yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the autumn wind, helicopters circling overhead, and photographs of a faded blue Chevrolet Caprice displayed on television broadcasts across the country. But those images tell only part of the story. Long before the nation learned the names John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo, they were simply two individuals moving through a society that rarely noticed them. They stood in convenience stores, stopped at traffic lights, purchased everyday items, and passed countless strangers who would never remember seeing them. There was nothing about their appearance that demanded attention. They did not resemble the larger-than-life villains audiences often expect from crime documentaries. They looked ordinary. History has repeatedly shown that ordinary appearances can conceal extraordinary intentions. John Allen Muhammad was born John Allen Williams in New Orleans, Louisiana, in 1960. His childhood was marked by instability and loss. His mother died when he was still very young, leaving him to be raised by relatives. Those early years were shaped by constant movement and uncertainty, experiences that many psychologists later considered significant, though never sufficient to explain the violence that would emerge decades later. As a young adult, Muhammad joined the United States Army. Military life offered something he had rarely experienced before: structure. Rules were clear. Expectations were defined. Discipline was rewarded. He trained as a marksman and eventually served during the Gulf War. Those who encountered him during parts of his military career often described someone capable, disciplined, and intelligent. He demonstrated patience, technical skill, and an ability to operate under pressure, qualities valued within the armed forces. Yet beneath that disciplined exterior, personal relationships often became increasingly turbulent. Marriages deteriorated. Arguments escalated. Financial problems surfaced. Friends and relatives would later describe a man who appeared to become increasingly controlling, increasingly suspicious, and increasingly convinced that the world had treated him unfairly. Court records from custody disputes painted a picture of growing resentment, particularly involving conflicts with his former wife over their children. It is tempting to search for a single moment that transforms an individual into a murderer. Reality is rarely so simple. Human behavior develops over years through countless decisions, experiences, beliefs, and relationships. Millions of people endure childhood trauma, divorce, military service, financial hardship, or personal disappointment without committing acts of violence. Those experiences may help explain aspects of a person's psychology, but they do not erase personal responsibility. Muhammad made choices. Repeatedly. Deliberately. Those choices gradually carried him toward a future few could have imagined. By the late 1990s, he had become increasingly isolated. Financial struggles intensified. Relationships fractured. According to later testimony and investigative findings, his thinking appeared to grow more rigid and conspiratorial. He spoke about society in increasingly hostile terms, expressing grievances that seemed to expand until entire institutions became the focus of his anger. While Muhammad's life was becoming more unstable, another story was unfolding thousands of miles away. Lee Boyd Malvo entered the world under entirely different circumstances. Born in Jamaica in 1985, Malvo spent much of his childhood moving between countries alongside his mother, who searched for economic opportunity and stability. Frequent relocations disrupted friendships and routines. The sense of belonging that many teenagers gradually develop remained elusive. When people later examined Malvo's early life, one theme appeared repeatedly: loneliness. Not the temporary loneliness every adolescent occasionally experiences. A deeper kind. The loneliness of constantly beginning again. New schools. New neighborhoods. New expectations. Few lasting relationships. By the time Malvo encountered Muhammad, he was still only a teenager trying to understand where he belonged. That meeting would alter both of their lives. Accounts differ regarding the exact evolution of their relationship, but investigators eventually concluded that Muhammad positioned himself as far more than a friend. He became a mentor, authority figure, father substitute, teacher, and ideological influence. For an adolescent searching for direction, that combination proved extraordinarily powerful. Control does not always begin with threats. More often, it begins with attention. Someone listens. Someone offers guidance. Someone provides certainty where confusion once existed. Gradually, dependence replaces independence. Questions become obedience. The relationship between Muhammad and Malvo would later become a central issue during court proceedings because it challenged simple explanations of guilt. Prosecutors argued that both men willingly participated in murder. Defense attorneys emphasized Malvo's age and the profound psychological influence Muhammad exercised over him. Those debates continue among psychologists and legal scholars even today. What remains undisputed is that their partnership became inseparable. Witnesses frequently saw them together. They traveled together, lived together, planned together, and eventually, according to overwhelming evidence presented in court, killed together. Yet none of that was visible to the public in October 2002. To everyone else, they remained anonymous faces. That anonymity was perhaps their greatest tactical advantage. America, after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, had become intensely focused on security. Airports adopted new procedures. Government buildings strengthened protective measures. Citizens remained alert for suspicious activity. Public awareness of potential threats had never been higher. Ironically, that heightened vigilance often focused attention toward dramatic possibilities. Explosives. Hijackings. Large coordinated attacks. Few imagined that the greatest danger would come from an aging sedan quietly blending into suburban traffic. Investigators would later discover that Mohammed's planning extended beyond selecting shooting locations. The modified Chevrolet Caprice reflected careful preparation rather than spontaneous violence. The concealed firing position inside the trunk reduced the likelihood of eyewitnesses identifying the shooter. It also allowed rapid departure immediately after each attack, often before anyone even understood where the shot had originated. The design exploited a basic limitation of human perception. People instinctively look toward loud sounds. But a supersonic rifle round can arrive before the sound of the gunshot reaches those nearby. Victims collapsed. Witnesses turned toward the crack. By then, the vehicle carrying the shooter could already be moving away, disappearing into ordinary traffic among hundreds of nearly identical cars. Every successful escape reinforced confidence. Every unsolved shooting encouraged further attacks. Investigators, however, refused to accept that the offender was invisible. Somewhere within every crime scene lay physical evidence. Microscopic traces. Bullet markings. Witness statements. Traffic patterns. Telephone records. Each piece appeared insignificant alone. Together, they would eventually reveal a hidden structure beneath what initially looked like complete randomness. For the moment, though, that structure remained concealed. The public knew only fragments released during carefully managed press conferences. Authorities intentionally withheld certain details to protect the integrity of the investigation and prevent false confessions. Reporters worked tirelessly to uncover additional information, but detectives understood that revealing too much could easily compromise future prosecutions. The result was an atmosphere where speculation flourished. Coffee shops buzzed with theories. Office conversations drifted toward rumors. Neighbors exchanged stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Every unfamiliar vehicle became suspicious. Every stranger attracted cautious glances. Communities remained united by one overwhelming reality. No one felt entirely safe. As fear spread across the region, investigators prepared to examine the lives of the people who had been struck down during those ordinary autumn days. Their names would soon become far more than entries in police reports. They were fathers and mothers, students and workers, husbands, wives, grandparents, and friends, individuals whose personal stories would remind the nation that behind every headline stood a human life interrupted without warning. Only by understanding who they were could anyone truly understand what had been stolen. The Beltway sniper investigation would eventually be remembered as one of the largest coordinated manhunts in modern American history, but in those first uncertain weeks, no one involved could see the ending. Detectives were not reading the final chapter. They were living inside a story that refused to reveal its pattern. Each sunrise carried the possibility that another call would come over the radio. Another victim. Another parking lot. Another family whose ordinary morning had ended with a single gunshot. Inside emergency operations centers, maps covering entire walls slowly filled with colored markers. Investigators stood for hours studying highways that intertwined like veins across Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. They measured distances between attacks, searching for geometry where there might be none. Some believed the shooter was following major transportation routes. Others argued the locations were selected because they offered easy escape paths. Behavioral profilers debated whether the attacks reflected military precision, personal revenge, or an offender seeking notoriety. Every theory explained part of the picture. None explained all of it. Outside those command rooms, the public witnessed only the visible surface of an enormous investigation. Patrol cars became a constant presence on roads that had once felt routine. Helicopters circled neighborhoods with rhythmic persistence. Tactical officers searched wooded areas after anonymous tips. Highway checkpoints appeared with little warning, forcing long lines of commuters to wait patiently while officers examined vehicles one by one. Drivers rarely complained. If anything, they welcomed the delays. Every police cruiser represented another attempt to stop whoever was responsible. Every checkpoint suggested that perhaps today would be the day the nightmare ended. But each unsuccessful search produced the same crushing realization. The sniper was still out there. As fear continued spreading, subtle changes reshaped the culture of an entire region. Schools adjusted outdoor activities. Sporting events reconsidered practice schedules. Local governments discussed emergency procedures that had never before seemed necessary. Businesses reminded employees to remain alert while walking to parking lots. Friends called one another after arriving home safely from work, not because they had always done so, but because reassurance itself had become a daily necessity. Communities discovered that fear is contagious. Not because people wanted to panic, but because uncertainty naturally fills the spaces where information is missing. And information was painfully scarce. Investigators intentionally revealed only limited details, hoping to protect evidence that only the true offenders would know. Reporters pursued every possible lead. National news networks interrupted regular programming whenever another shooting occurred. The case expanded far beyond the Washington metropolitan area, becoming a story followed across the United States and around the world. Millions watched from thousands of miles away. Residents lived it. That difference mattered. Watching fear on television is profoundly different from walking through it. The residents of Maryland, Virginia, and Washington no longer experienced parking lots as simple places between a building and a car. They became exposed landscapes. Gas stations no longer represented convenience. They represented vulnerability. Even standing beside a mailbox or loading groceries into a trunk carried a quiet awareness that had not existed weeks earlier. Daily life had not stopped. It had simply become heavier. Yet amid that growing weight, investigators slowly accumulated something more valuable than rumors. Evidence. Not enough to identify the offenders. Not yet. But enough to establish that the crimes were linked, that the same weapon had been used repeatedly, and that the shooter demonstrated remarkable consistency in both patience and accuracy. Those findings narrowed certain possibilities while opening countless others. Was the shooter acting alone? Was there an accomplice? Was the motive ideological, financial, personal, psychological? Every unanswered question increased pressure on the investigators responsible for protecting millions of people. No detective wanted to be the officer standing before another grieving family explaining that the killer remained unidentified. No commander wanted to hold another press conference without meaningful progress. No community wanted another funeral. Still, the attacks continued. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, it is tempting to imagine that the investigation advanced steadily toward its conclusion. The reality was far more uncertain. Progress came in fragments, often hidden beneath setbacks that consumed precious time. Witness descriptions conflicted. Leads appeared promising before collapsing. Innocent people found themselves questioned simply because their vehicles resembled early descriptions broadcast by the media. The truth remained frustratingly close and impossibly distant at the same time. That tension defined the entire case. It also shaped the emotional landscape in which the victims' families were forced to grieve. While investigators searched for patterns and journalists searched for answers, families searched for something much smaller and infinitely more painful. Normality. A familiar voice that would never again answer the telephone. A seat at the dinner table that would remain empty. Plans that would never be completed. Those private losses rarely fit into television broadcasts measured in minutes, yet they formed the true heart of the tragedy. The headlines focused on the sniper. History would eventually remember the victims. And that is where our story must now turn. Because before they became names in police files or photographs shown during news coverage, They were people living ordinary lives filled with ordinary hopes. They were not symbols. They were individuals whose futures extended beyond that October morning, futures that ended without warning because two strangers decided that another human life could be reduced to the squeeze of a trigger. In the next chapter, we step away from the maps, the command centers, and the manhunt to meet those whose stories deserve to be told first. Their lives, their families, their routines, and the moments that existed before violence interrupted them reveal the true cost of the Beltway sniper attacks far more powerfully than any statistic ever could. Only by understanding who the victims were can we fully understand what the Washington region lost during those 22 days that forever changed the autumn of 2002. When history remembers a crime, it often remembers the people who committed it more easily than the people who suffered because of it. Names of killers become documentaries, headlines, and courtroom records. Their photographs are analyzed, their motives debated, their childhoods dissected in books and interviews. Meanwhile, the victims risk becoming something far smaller than the lives they actually lived. A photograph on a memorial page. A line in a timeline. A statistic repeated so many times that it begins to lose its weight. 10 people were killed. 3 more survived with devastating injuries. The sentence is factually correct. It is also painfully incomplete. Because no family remembers a loved one as a number. No child grows up remembering a parent as victim number 3. Every one of those lives contained thousands of ordinary moments that never appeared in police reports. Morning conversations over breakfast. Birthdays celebrated around crowded tables. Inside jokes understood only by close friends. Favorite restaurants. Weekend traditions. Holiday photographs tucked inside albums that would later become priceless because no new pictures would ever be added. The Beltway sniper attacks did not simply end lives. They interrupted stories. Stories that had been unfolding for decades. Stories that were supposed to continue long after October 2002 had passed. The first chapter of those stories begins with a man named James Martin. To most people driving through Wheaton, Maryland, on the morning of October 2, 2002, he was simply another face among hundreds of commuters beginning another workday. No television cameras followed him. No newspaper reporters knew his name. There was nothing extraordinary about the way his morning unfolded because it was built upon the same quiet routine that had shaped countless mornings before it. James Martin was 55 years old. He had spent much of his life working hard, building a future through consistency rather than headlines. Friends described him as dependable, the kind of person whose promises rarely needed repeating because if he said he would do something, he simply did it. Reliability is one of those qualities that often goes unnoticed until the person who embodied it is suddenly gone. To those who loved him, James was more than an employee or a neighbor. He was a husband. A father. A grandfather. Someone whose presence had become woven into the everyday rhythm of family life. Like so many people across the Washington metropolitan area, he had no reason to believe that Wednesday morning would differ from any other. The weather carried the familiar coolness of early autumn. The sky stretched clear above suburban streets beginning to fill with traffic. Leaves had started collecting along curbs, stirred occasionally by passing cars or gentle gusts of wind. It was the kind of morning that invited thoughts toward the future rather than danger. Perhaps there were errands waiting after work. Perhaps dinner plans. Perhaps nothing more complicated than another ordinary evening at home. Whatever occupied his mind, it almost certainly was not fear. At approximately 8 o'clock that morning, James arrived at the parking lot of a grocery store in Wheaton. Parking lots are places people rarely remember. They exist between destinations. Temporary spaces where shopping lists are reviewed, car doors are locked, and conversations pause before continuing inside stores. Thousands of people crossed that same pavement every week without giving it a second thought. James stepped from his vehicle. He began walking. Somewhere beyond what anyone nearby could see, another person had already made a decision. There was no warning. No confrontation. No shouted threat. Only a single rifle shot. For the people standing nearby, confusion arrived before panic. The sound echoed across the shopping center, sharp enough to draw attention but unfamiliar enough that many struggled to identify it. Some thought a tire had burst. Others imagined construction equipment or a vehicle backfiring somewhere beyond the parking lot. Then they saw a man lying on the pavement. People ran toward him. Someone called for help. Another searched desperately for signs that he might still be alive. Within moments, emergency responders were racing toward a scene that looked almost impossible to understand. There was no obvious shooter. No one fleeing. No weapon abandoned nearby. Just an ordinary parking lot that had become a homicide scene in less than a second. James Martin became the first officially recognized fatal victim of what would soon become known as the Beltway sniper attacks. No one knew that at the time. Investigators approached the scene as they would any unexplained killing. Officers secured the area while detectives interviewed witnesses who had seen almost nothing. Forensic specialists searched for evidence that appeared frustratingly scarce. Every minute generated more questions than answers. Who fired the shot? From where? Why James? Those questions remained unanswered because, in truth, James had not been selected for anything he had done. He had simply occupied the wrong place at the wrong moment. That reality would become one of the most terrifying characteristics of the entire case. Elsewhere, life continued normally because almost nobody understood what had happened. Parents dropped children at school. Office meetings began on schedule. Cash registers rang inside nearby stores. Radio stations discussed weather forecasts and traffic reports while investigators quietly examined a parking lot that would soon be surrounded by yellow crime scene tape. The news spread gradually. An unexplained shooting. One victim. Authorities investigating. For many residents, it sounded tragic but isolated. Terrible things happen, people told themselves. Perhaps this was another isolated act of violence. Perhaps the motive would soon become clear. No one yet imagined that the morning's tragedy marked only the beginning. While detectives were still processing evidence in Wheaton, another family elsewhere in the region was unknowingly moving toward the same unimaginable heartbreak. That family belonged to 62-year-old James Buchanan. Known to friends as someone who enjoyed working outdoors, Buchanan represented another familiar figure in suburban America. Retirement had not diminished his appreciation for simple routines. Like many homeowners, he took pride in maintaining his property, treating yard work not as a burden but as part of caring for the place he called home. There is something deeply peaceful about mowing a lawn during early autumn. The air feels lighter than summer. The engine hums steadily. Fresh-cut grass mixes with the scent of fallen leaves. It is the kind of ordinary task that encourages quiet reflection because it requires little concentration. On the afternoon of October 2nd, James Buchanan was doing exactly that outside his home in Aspen Hill, Maryland. Neighbors likely saw nothing unusual. A man cutting his grass. Another ordinary suburban afternoon. Then, just as suddenly as the morning attack in Wheaton, a single bullet shattered that ordinary scene. The rifle shot echoed briefly before silence returned. The lawn mower continued running. Its engine kept humming even after the man pushing it had collapsed. When neighbors rushed outside, they encountered a scene that defied explanation. There had been no argument. No intruder. No struggle. Only a homeowner lying in his own yard. For investigators, the similarities to the earlier shooting were impossible to ignore. A single, carefully placed shot. No visible suspect. No apparent motive. No eyewitness who could explain what had happened. 2 victims. 2 different locations. 1 single day. The possibility that these crimes were connected was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Yet even then, almost no one grasped the scale of what was unfolding. Families across Maryland prepared dinner. Children completed homework. Evening news broadcasts reported 2 mysterious shootings. The public watched with sympathy. Very few watched with fear. That would change soon enough. Because somewhere beyond the reach of flashing emergency lights, the people responsible had already proven that they could strike without warning, disappear without being seen. and leave investigators with little more than unanswered questions and grieving families whose lives had been forever divided into a world before October 2nd and everything that came after. As the sun disappeared behind the tree-lined neighborhoods of Montgomery County on October 2nd, investigators remained scattered across two separate crime scenes, comparing notes that seemed too similar to ignore. Both victims had been struck by a single rifle round. Both attacks had occurred in broad daylight. Neither scene offered witnesses who could point investigators toward a fleeing suspect. The evidence suggested precision rather than impulse, patience rather than panic. For detectives, those similarities were unsettling. For the families waiting at home, they meant nothing. Not yet. Because grief arrives long before understanding. When police officers knock on a front door, they do not bring explanations. They bring absence. A husband who will never return from work. A father whose chair at the dinner table will remain empty. A grandfather whose voice will exist only in memory. The investigations would continue for weeks. The mourning had already begun. While news stations prepared evening broadcasts describing two unexplained shootings in suburban Maryland, another family was settling into what they believed would be an ordinary night. Bills still needed to be paid. Children still had homework. Televisions played quietly in living rooms across the region. Most viewers listened with concern, but not with personal fear. The incidents felt tragic, yet distant enough to belong to someone else's story. That illusion lasted less than 24 hours. The following morning, October 3rd, dawn broke beneath another clear autumn sky. Commuters poured onto highways before sunrise, coffee cups balanced inside cup holders as traffic slowly thickened around the Capitol Beltway. Office buildings welcomed employees carrying briefcases and backpacks. Delivery trucks followed familiar routes. School buses completed their morning pickups. Routine had survived another night. Or at least it appeared to. Among those beginning the day was Dr. Prem Kumar Walekar, a 54-year-old immigrant from India who had built a life defined by education, perseverance, and service. He was a physician, a husband, and a father. Like countless doctors across the country, much of his life revolved around caring for people he had never met before they entered his examination room. Medicine is a profession built upon optimism. Every diagnosis carries the hope that suffering can be reduced. Every patient represents another opportunity to improve someone's life. Friends and colleagues remembered Walekar as thoughtful, hardworking, and deeply committed to his family. He had traveled thousands of miles to create opportunities that many immigrants dream about but few achieve easily. Years of education, sacrifice, and determination had gradually become a stable life in suburban Maryland. On that Thursday morning, he stopped at a gas station in Aspen Hill. There was nothing remarkable about the decision. People stop for fuel because they need to reach work. Because errands cannot wait. Because life moves according to practical necessities rather than dramatic moments. He stepped from his vehicle. Removed the fuel nozzle. Began another task so routine that most people complete it without forming any lasting memory of the experience. Somewhere beyond the station, hidden from every customer filling their tanks, someone watched through a rifle scope. Distance erased identity. The doctor was not seen as a physician. Not as a husband. Not as a father. Only as a target. The shot came without warning. The sound echoed across the gas station before anyone understood what had happened. Customers instinctively turned toward the noise. Some froze. Others ducked behind vehicles. Several looked around searching for the person responsible, expecting to see a gunman running away. There was no one. Only a man collapsing beside the fuel pump. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the outcome was already becoming tragically familiar. Another life had ended. Another family would soon receive a phone call capable of dividing time into before and after. By now, investigators could no longer dismiss coincidence. 3 victims. 3 carefully aimed rifle shots. No apparent connection. No visible suspect. A pattern was beginning to emerge, although no one yet understood how terrifying that pattern would become. As authorities rushed to process the newest crime scene, life elsewhere continued with stubborn normality. Children laughed during recess. Office meetings filled conference rooms. Shoppers compared prices inside supermarkets. Yet beneath that normality, anxiety had begun quietly spreading. People who heard the morning news found themselves glancing over their shoulders while crossing parking lots. Drivers lingered inside their vehicles before stepping outside. Questions drifted through workplaces and neighborhood conversations. Could the shootings be connected? Was someone targeting random people? Was it safe to stop for gas? No one had answers. Only hours after Wailcar's death, those questions became even more urgent. At approximately 10:30 that morning, another shot rang out. This time the victim was Sarah Ramos, a 34-year-old woman employed as a babysitter and housekeeper. Friends remembered her as warm, dependable, and deeply devoted to the children she cared for. She had come to the United States seeking opportunities that would allow her to support family members and build a better future. Her morning had been filled with ordinary responsibilities. She had completed routine errands. She had visited a shopping center. She had no reason to believe that simply walking across a parking lot could place her in mortal danger. Witnesses later described hearing what sounded like a single loud crack. Then confusion. People looked around trying to identify the source. Sarah fell before anyone could comprehend what had happened. Panic spread almost instantly. Shoppers abandoned carts. Employees rushed outside. Emergency calls flooded dispatch centers. By now, police officers responding to the scene carried a terrifying realization with them. This was no longer an isolated incident. Someone was hunting strangers. The randomness of the attacks became their defining horror. Investigators routinely search for relationships between victims because relationships often reveal motive. Family disputes, business conflicts, financial disagreements, personal revenge. But James Martin had never known James Buchanan. Neither had known Prem Kumar Wailcar. None had known Sarah Ramos. Their lives had traveled entirely separate paths. The only thing connecting them was the invisible crosshair of someone they would never meet. Behavioral analysts began confronting an unsettling possibility. If victim selection was genuinely random, predicting the next attack would become extraordinarily difficult. Randomness destroys strategy. Police can protect individuals receiving threats. They can monitor suspects targeting specific locations. They can increase patrols around known risks. But how do you defend an entire metropolitan region against someone who may choose any parking lot, any sidewalk, any gas station, at any hour? That question hung over every briefing room. Meanwhile, television news transformed from cautious reporting into continuous coverage. Helicopter footage showed investigators moving methodically through crime scenes. Maps expanded with every new attack. Reporters repeated the same haunting observation. The victims appeared to have been chosen completely at random. For millions watching at home, that sentence changed everything. Random meant anyone. Random meant everywhere. Random meant the next victim might already be leaving home without realizing it. Fear no longer belonged exclusively to the families already grieving. It had begun spreading through an entire community. Yet the deepest pain still rested inside those homes where ordinary conversations had been permanently interrupted. Family members sorted through belongings that still carried familiar scents. Voicemail messages became impossible to delete. Half-finished plans remained written on calendars. Small routines, the morning phone call, the evening greeting at the front door, the shared meal after work ended without anyone realizing the previous day had been the last time they would ever happen. The investigation was growing larger by the hour. So too was the human cost. And before the week was over, more names would be added to a list that no family ever imagined becoming part of, a list that would ultimately define one of the most terrifying crime sprees in modern American history. The most painful aspect of the Beltway sniper attacks was not only the suddenness of the violence, but the complete separation between the victims and the people who destroyed their lives. There was no history between them. No argument waiting to be uncovered. No personal betrayal. No moment that could be replayed and analyzed as the beginning of a conflict. The victims did not know their killers. They never spoke to them. They never saw them. They never had the chance to understand why their lives were being taken. To the shooters, they were locations on a map. To their families, they were irreplaceable. By the second week of October 2002, the names of the victims had become familiar to investigators and increasingly familiar to the public. But behind every name was an entire human story that could never be reduced to the circumstances of a death. One of those stories belonged to Linda Franklin, a 47-year-old woman whose life represented the kind of quiet dedication that rarely appears in headlines but forms the foundation of every community. Linda worked as a financial analyst for the federal government. She was intelligent, organized, and respected by colleagues who knew her as someone who approached responsibilities with patience and professionalism. Like many people who spend years building a career, she had created a life centered around stability, family, and the small routines that make adulthood feel meaningful. She was not someone searching for adventure that afternoon. She was not taking unnecessary risks. She was simply completing an ordinary task. On October 14th, Linda and her husband visited a shopping center in Falls Church, Virginia. It was a familiar place filled with the everyday sounds of suburban life. Vehicles moved slowly through parking lanes. Shoppers carried bags toward their cars. Employees returned carts. Conversations blended together beneath the open sky. Nothing about the afternoon suggested danger. That was what made the attacks so psychologically devastating. The locations were not dark alleys. They were not isolated roads late at night. They were places specifically associated with safety and normal life. People did not expect danger while walking toward their cars after shopping. They did not expect danger while filling a gas tank. They did not expect danger while standing in their own yards. Linda Franklin was walking through that parking lot when a single bullet ended her life. The attack occurred quickly. The shooter was not visible. The weapon was not recovered. The person responsible disappeared before anyone nearby understood what they had witnessed. For investigators, Franklin's death represented another devastating confirmation. The sniper had crossed into Virginia. The geographical range was expanding. The fear was expanding with it. By this point, residents across the region were no longer asking whether the shootings were connected. They knew. The question had changed. Where would the shooter strike next? And who would be there when it happened? The psychological impact reached far beyond the immediate crime scenes. The attacks had created something unusual even among serial crimes, a sense that ordinary existence itself had become unsafe. People could understand avoiding certain places. They could understand being cautious around known dangers. But avoiding every parking lot, every sidewalk, every public space was impossible. Modern life requires people to exist in open spaces. The sniper had turned that unavoidable reality into a source of fear. Every person in the region was forced to confront a disturbing thought. The next victim could be anyone. Not someone reckless. Not someone involved in danger. Anyone. That fear became especially painful because the victims represented such ordinary, familiar lives. They were not connected by occupation or social status. They were connected only by humanity. Among those victims was Conrad Johnson, a 40-year-old bus driver in Montgomery County, Maryland. Johnson's life was defined by service. Every day, he carried children to school and helped families move through their daily routines safely. For many passengers, a school bus driver is one of those familiar community figures who becomes part of childhood memories without people always realizing it. Children remember the friendly driver who greeted them every morning. Parents remember the person trusted with their children's safety. Colleagues remember the person who arrived early, completed the route, and carried out a responsibility that demanded patience and care. On October 22nd, Conrad Johnson was doing what he had done countless times before. He was working. He was driving. He was preparing for another ordinary day. While operating his school bus in Aspen Hill, Maryland, he was shot. The circumstances created a new level of fear. The sniper had already attacked parking lots, gas stations, and shopping areas. Now a person performing a public service had become a target. Communities that were already frightened felt another layer of vulnerability. If a bus driver could be attacked, where was safety? If someone working to protect children could become a victim, what places remained untouched? The answer appeared increasingly clear. None. Johnson died from his injuries. His death became the final fatal shooting during the main October attack sequence before the arrest of Muhammad and Malvo. But at that moment, no one knew the end had arrived. There was no sense of relief. No celebration. Only exhaustion. The region remained trapped in uncertainty. People continued waiting for the next headline. The next emergency announcement. The next photograph of another crime scene. For the families of the victims, the passage of time offered little comfort. Grief does not follow the same schedule as investigations. Police can organize evidence. Prosecutors can prepare cases. Courts can eventually deliver verdicts. Families cannot simply move through those stages and leave the pain behind. They return home to houses filled with reminders. A favorite chair. A jacket hanging in a closet. A phone number that will never answer. A voice recording preserved because deleting it feels impossible. The world may eventually move on from a news story. Families never move on from losing a person. They learn how to carry the absence. That distinction is essential when remembering the Beltway sniper case. The story is often told through the actions of the perpetrators, their planning, their movements, their capture, and their trials. Those details matter because understanding the crime is part of preventing similar tragedies in the future. But the center of this story is not the people who held the weapon. It is the people whose lives were taken. The victims were parents who had children waiting at home. Partners who had shared years of memories. Workers who contributed to their communities. Neighbors who waved hello. People who had plans for tomorrow. The sniper attacks lasted 22 days. The consequences lasted far longer. For the public, the fear eventually faded. For investigators, the case eventually closed. For the courts, sentences were eventually handed down. But for the families left behind, October 2002 never truly ended. Because every anniversary brings back the date. Every empty chair tells the story again. Every memory becomes a reminder of a future that should have existed but never arrived. The victims of the Beltway sniper attacks were not chosen because of who they were. They were chosen because they were available. That random cruelty is what made the case so terrifying. But their lives were not random. Their lives had meaning long before a criminal decided to turn them into headlines. And before the investigation would uncover the people responsible, before the hidden evidence would finally connect two men to a trail of violence, the nation was left with one overwhelming question. How could someone commit such unimaginable acts against complete strangers? To answer that question, investigators would have to look beyond the crime scenes. They would have to follow the evidence. And eventually, they would have to enter the minds of the two people who created the nightmare. The first thing people remember about terror is usually the moment it arrives. The explosion. The scream. The sudden movement that tells everyone something has changed. But the Beltway sniper attacks were different. There was no dramatic entrance. No warning. No visible enemy charging toward a crowd. The violence arrived quietly, almost invisibly, hidden inside ordinary moments that millions of people experience every day. That was what made it so deeply disturbing. The attacks did not begin in a battlefield. They began in places where people believed they were safe. A grocery store parking lot. A suburban lawn. A gas station. A shopping center. A place where someone stopped for fuel before work. A place where someone walked back to their car carrying groceries. A place where someone stepped outside for only a few minutes. The victims were not entering danger. They were simply living. And somewhere nearby, two men were watching. October 2nd, 2002, began like any other autumn morning in the Washington metropolitan area. The rush hour traffic moved slowly along the highways. Office workers headed toward government buildings and corporate campuses. Parents dropped children off at school. Store employees unlocked doors and prepared for another day of business. The region had no reason to believe that by the end of that day, the sense of security that had defined everyday life would be permanently damaged. The first attack occurred in Wheaton, Maryland. James Martin arrived at a shopping center, carrying out a normal task during a normal morning. There was no indication that anyone was following him. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing separated that moment from thousands of similar moments happening across the country. A person walks through a parking lot. A car door closes. Footsteps move across pavement. A hand reaches for a key. Then everything changes. A rifle shot cuts through the morning. The sound is brief. Almost too brief. A few people nearby hear something unusual, but the human brain searches for familiar explanations before accepting something impossible. A car accident. Construction noise. Something falling. Anything except the idea that a person standing in an open parking lot has just been attacked by someone they cannot see. Then they notice the man on the ground. The confusion comes first. The horror follows. People rush toward Martin, trying to understand what happened. Someone calls emergency services. Someone looks around for the attacker. Someone asks the question that would be repeated again and again throughout the next 3 weeks. Where did the shot come from? There is no answer. The shooter is already gone. The crime scene appears strangely empty. There is no confrontation to reconstruct. No argument to investigate. No obvious motive waiting beneath the surface. Just a victim. Just a bullet. Just a question. At first, authorities treated the case as an individual homicide. That was reasonable. A single shooting in a large metropolitan area was tragic, but not unheard of. Detectives had investigated countless violent crimes before. They knew how to examine evidence, interview witnesses, and search for suspects. But later that same day, another shot would force them to reconsider everything. Only hours after Martin was killed, another person would fall. This time, the victim was James Buchanan. Buchanan was outside his home in Aspen Hill, Maryland, performing one of the most ordinary suburban activities imaginable, mowing his lawn. There is something almost symbolic about that image. A person standing in his own yard. A place associated with privacy and comfort. A place where people wave to neighbors, check the mail, play with children, and take pride in maintaining their homes. The sound of a lawn mower usually represents routine. The machine continues its repetitive movement while the person operating it thinks about everyday concerns. Weekend plans. Household chores. Upcoming appointments. Nobody expects a threat while standing outside their own home. But that afternoon, Buchanan became the second victim. The attack happened with the same horrifying efficiency. One shot. One target. One person who had no opportunity to understand what was happening. When neighbors came outside, they were confronted with a scene that seemed impossible. A familiar person from the community was suddenly gone. The place where children played and families lived had become a crime scene. Investigators now had 2 separate victims. 2 different locations. One day. The similarities were too strong to ignore. The possibility emerged that they were not dealing with unrelated crimes. They might be facing a single shooter. But if that was true, the questions became even more frightening. Why these people? Why these places? Who was next? The following morning brought another attack. October 3rd. The date would become another painful marker in the timeline. Dr. Prem Kumar Walekar stopped at a gas station in Aspen Hill, Maryland. He was not involved in anything dangerous. He was not meeting someone suspicious. He was simply doing what millions of drivers do every week. Buying fuel. Gas stations are among the most ordinary locations in modern life. People stop there between work and home. They check their phones while waiting. They watch the numbers climb on the pump. They think about their next destination. Wailcar was a physician. A man whose profession was built around saving lives. He had spent years caring for others. Now, in a moment that lasted only seconds, his own life was taken. The attack shocked investigators because it demonstrated that the shooter was not limited to one type of environment. Parking lots, residential areas, and now a gas station. There was no safe location. No predictable pattern. The sniper could appear anywhere. Later that same day, another victim was discovered. Sarah Ramos. Another person living an ordinary life. Another family suddenly forced into a reality they never expected. The pattern was becoming clearer. The shooter was not choosing people because of personal connections. The victims were strangers. Completely unrelated. That fact created a different kind of terror. A criminal with a specific target can sometimes be avoided. A criminal driven by random selection creates fear everywhere. The question was no longer, who is in danger? The question became, who isn't? Across Maryland and Virginia, people began changing their behavior. They walked quickly through parking lots. They avoided standing outside longer than necessary. They watched news reports constantly, searching for information that might help them understand the threat. The advice seemed simple. Be careful. Stay alert. Pay attention. But those instructions offered little comfort because the danger was almost impossible to identify. How do you recognize someone who does not need to get close? How do you protect yourself from someone who never speaks to you? How do you escape an attack you cannot see coming? The sniper had created a situation where distance became the weapon. The shooter did not need confrontation. He did not need control of the environment. He only needed a moment. And then he disappeared. As more attacks followed, investigators realized they were not chasing a traditional criminal. They were chasing someone who had transformed an ordinary vehicle into a mobile hiding place. The Chevrolet Caprice blended into traffic. That was its strength. It was not a suspicious-looking getaway car from a movie. It was a vehicle people ignored. The shooter could leave one location, enter the flow of thousands of commuters, and become another anonymous driver heading somewhere unknown. The entire Washington region became part of the crime scene. Highways became escape routes. Parking lots became potential attack zones. Public spaces became places of uncertainty. The Beltway itself, normally a symbol of daily commuting and connection, became associated with something much darker. Fear. By the middle of October, the attacks had transformed the emotional landscape of the region. Parents watched their children more closely. Workers looked around before walking to their cars. People who had never thought twice about being outside during daylight began calculating risks that had never existed in their minds before. The sniper had not only taken lives. He had taken something less visible. The simple confidence that tomorrow would be ordinary. And while the public searched for answers, while police departments struggled to connect the evidence, and while families mourned those they had lost, the two men responsible remained hidden among the millions of people moving through the same streets every day. The hunt had begun. But the nightmare was far from over. The most frightening aspect of the Beltway sniper attacks was not only the number of victims, but the way the attacks slowly transformed the meaning of ordinary life. Before October 2002, a person walking through a parking lot was simply walking through a parking lot. A person stopping at a gas station was simply buying fuel. A person stepping outside their home to complete a chore was simply taking care of their property. Those moments were invisible because they were so common. They were the background noise of existence. But the sniper changed that. He turned seconds into memories. Locations into threats. Routine into uncertainty. After the first several attacks, investigators understood that they were dealing with a criminal who was not driven by opportunity in the traditional sense. This was not someone who happened upon victims during a robbery or an argument. The attacks required patience. They required planning. They required someone willing to observe ordinary people going about ordinary lives and reduce them to a single moment viewed through a rifle scope. That realization disturbed investigators because it suggested a level of preparation beyond a spontaneous act of violence. The shooter was choosing when to act. The shooter was choosing where to wait. The shooter was choosing when to disappear. Every attack seemed designed to create maximum fear with minimal exposure. The victim would be discovered. The community would panic. Police would arrive. News cameras would appear. And somewhere beyond the chaos, the person responsible would already be gone. By the middle of October, the Washington region had begun to feel like it was living inside an invisible emergency. The public did not know where the next attack would happen, but many had begun assuming another one would come. The uncertainty became its own form of punishment. People can adapt to a known danger. They can prepare for a storm when they know the storm is coming. They can evacuate when they know where the fire is spreading. But how do you prepare for something that has no obvious shape? The sniper attacks created a danger that existed everywhere and nowhere at the same time. A person standing in a crowded shopping area could be completely safe. Or they could be seconds away from tragedy. There was no way to know. On October 9th, the investigation took another disturbing turn when a shooting occurred in Manassas, Virginia. The victim was Dean Harold Mayers, a 53-year-old man who was simply traveling through the area. Like the others before him, Mayers had no connection to the shooter. He was not involved in a dispute. He was not being pursued. He was not part of any conflict. He was a stranger selected by chance. Mayers was shot while near a gas station, another location that had now become permanently associated with fear. The place where people once stopped for a few minutes between destinations had become somewhere customers entered quickly, looking around before approaching the pump. The attack carried a terrifying message. The sniper was no longer confined to one county. The threat had expanded. Virginia was now part of the nightmare. The geographical spread made the investigation even more complicated. Different police departments had different crime scenes, different witnesses, different initial assumptions. But the evidence increasingly pointed toward a single offender or group responsible for multiple shootings. The question was not whether the attacks were connected. The question was how many more were coming. 3 days later, on October 11th, another victim was attacked. This time, the location was a parking lot outside a home improvement store in Fredericksburg, Virginia. The victim was Kenneth Bridges, 39 years old. Bridges was a man whose life revolved around family and work. He was not famous. He was not someone whose name appeared in newspapers before that day. Like most victims in this case, he represented the millions of people who quietly build lives without ever expecting to become part of history. He had walked into that parking lot for a simple reason. He needed to be there. That was all it took. The attack happened quickly. Another single shot. Another person collapsing. Another scene where investigators searched for answers while the killer vanished. By now, the public had begun to understand the pattern. The sniper did not need to know you. The sniper did not need to hate you. The sniper only needed you to exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was the psychological weapon behind the crimes. The victims were random, but the fear was universal. Everyone could imagine themselves in the same position. Everyone had visited a gas station. Everyone had crossed a parking lot. Everyone had stood outside. The sniper had taken everyday actions and attached a terrifying possibility to them. In many homes, conversations changed. Families discussed safety in ways they never had before. Parents told children not to linger outside. Spouses called each other after arriving safely. Friends exchanged warnings. Be careful. Watch your surroundings. Call me when you get there. Simple phrases became expressions of fear. The investigation itself was also entering unfamiliar territory. Police departments had investigated serial offenders before, but few cases created such a broad public threat. The attacks crossed city and state boundaries. The shooter appeared mobile, disciplined, and unpredictable. Investigators had to consider possibilities that seemed almost endless. Was the shooter a former soldier? Was the shooter working alone? Was the shooter connected to extremist groups? Was the motive personal? Political? Financial? Was the shooter trying to communicate something? At that stage, every possibility remained open. The absence of clear motive became one of the most disturbing elements of the case. A criminal who wants money makes demands. A criminal seeking revenge targets specific individuals. A criminal driven by ideology leaves messages. But the Beltway sniper seemed silent. The violence itself was the message. And that terrified investigators. Because without understanding why someone was doing this, predicting what they might do next became almost impossible. Behind the scenes, however, evidence was accumulating. The bullets recovered from different crime scenes revealed similarities. The shooting style revealed consistency. The distances, the timing, and the precision all suggested the work of someone who understood firearms. The idea that the shooter might possess military experience became increasingly discussed among investigators. But while experts debated theories, the public continued searching for a face. A name. Anything. The media released descriptions from witnesses, though many accounts differed. Some remembered different vehicles. Some recalled different colors. Some believed they saw certain individuals while others saw nothing at all. Every report had to be considered carefully. Every possibility had to be tested. But the sniper benefited from confusion. The more uncertainty surrounded the case, the easier it became for the person responsible to remain hidden. The attacks continued to change the region's behavior. Businesses installed additional security measures. Police increased patrols. Residents watched news updates obsessively. The phrase Beltway sniper began appearing everywhere, turning a geographical feature into a symbol of fear. The capital Beltway had always represented movement. Millions of people used it every day to travel between homes, workplaces, schools, and communities. Now the word Beltway carried another meaning. It represented vulnerability. It represented the possibility that danger could travel alongside you without being noticed. Yet even as fear reached its highest point, the people responsible remained unidentified. The public saw only the aftermath. The investigators saw only fragments. And the victims' families saw only the empty spaces left behind. The final attack sequence was still unfolding. More evidence would emerge. More questions would be asked. And eventually, one of the most unexpected clues in the investigation would come not from the crime scenes in Maryland or Virginia, but from a connection far away that would begin pulling the entire case together. But before that breakthrough arrived, the sniper would strike again. And with each attack, the Washington region moved closer to realizing that the person they feared was not just a distant threat. He was someone moving among them. By the third week of October 2002, the Washington metropolitan area had reached a point where fear had become part of the daily routine. That may have been the most disturbing achievement of the Beltway snipers. They had not only taken lives. They had altered behavior. They had changed the way millions of people experienced ordinary moments. A person walking into a store no longer thought only about what they needed to buy. They thought about the open space between their car and the entrance. A parent watching a child play outside no longer saw only laughter and movement. They saw distance, visibility, and vulnerability. A driver stopping at a traffic light might look into nearby vehicles and wonder whether the person beside them was simply another commuter or something far more dangerous. The sniper had created a world where suspicion replaced certainty. And still, the attacks continued. On October 14th, the investigation suffered another devastating blow when Linda Franklin was killed outside a shopping center in Falls Church, Virginia. Franklin was 47 years old, a wife, a professional, and a respected member of her community. She worked as a financial analyst for the federal government, a position requiring attention to detail, responsibility, and trust. To colleagues, she was not a headline. She was the person who arrived at work, completed her responsibilities, and contributed to the organization around her. To her family, she was irreplaceable. That afternoon, she was at the Seven Corners shopping area with her husband. It was the kind of place where thousands of people passed through every day. Cars moved slowly between rows of parking spaces. Shoppers carried bags toward their vehicles. Employees collected carts left behind by customers. It was not a location anyone would associate with danger. That was precisely why it was so terrifying. The attack happened quickly. A single shot. A moment of confusion. A crowd suddenly trying to understand something that made no sense. Witnesses looked around, searching for the source of the sound. Some expected to see a person running. Others expected some kind of visible explanation. There was none. The shooter had disappeared before anyone knew what they were looking for. Franklin's death marked a painful turning point. The sniper had now demonstrated that distance and geography did not matter. The attacks were not limited to one community. They were not confined to one county or one state. The entire region was exposed. Virginia residents who had watched events unfold in Maryland now understood that the danger had reached their neighborhoods. The psychological boundaries people relied upon had collapsed. The idea of somewhere else disappeared. There was no longer a place where people could confidently say, "That would never happen here." Because it had happened there. It had happened everywhere. Investigators continued searching for patterns, but the randomness remained one of their greatest obstacles. Serial offenders often reveal themselves through consistency. They choose similar victims, similar locations, similar methods. The Beltway sniper did have consistency, but it was hidden beneath apparent randomness. The weapon was consistent. The precision was consistent. The escape method was consistent. But the victims seemed completely different. That contradiction complicated the investigation. How could someone be so methodical and yet appear so unpredictable? The answer would eventually become clear. The randomness itself was part of the design. By selecting strangers, the shooter maximized fear while minimizing the chance that investigators could quickly identify a motive. Everyone became a possible target. No one understood why. That uncertainty became a weapon more powerful than the rifle itself. 5 days after Franklin's murder, another attack would push the region closer to complete panic. On October 19, 14-year-old Iran Brown was shot outside Benjamin Tasker Middle School in Bowie, Maryland. Unlike previous victims, Iran survived. But the circumstances surrounding the attack created a new level of fear. A child had been targeted. Schools had already become places of concern for parents. Administrators had restricted outdoor activities. Teachers had adjusted routines. Children were learning that adults around them were afraid, even if nobody wanted to say it directly. Then a teenager was shot outside a school. For parents across the region, the attack felt personal. The places they trusted most, the places where they sent their children every morning, no longer felt completely protected. Iran Brown was 14 years old, standing outside before school began when the sniper's bullet struck him. The attack was different in another important way. For the first time, the sniper had not killed. A young victim survived. Emergency responders rushed Brown to receive medical treatment. The community watched closely, hoping for a recovery that could provide at least one piece of positive news during a period dominated by tragedy. His survival also provided investigators with valuable information. Every victim, every witness, every piece of evidence mattered. A survivor could potentially offer details unavailable in previous attacks. But even as authorities investigated, the public remained trapped in fear. If a teenager could be attacked near a school, nowhere seemed beyond reach. Parents who had already been struggling with anxiety now faced an impossible emotional conflict. They had to send their children into the world. They had to trust schools. They had to trust communities. They had to trust that law enforcement would find whoever was responsible. But trust becomes difficult when danger has no face. The next attack came only days later. On October 22, the sniper struck again. This time, the victim was Conrad Johnson, a 40-year-old bus driver in Montgomery County, Maryland. Johnson represented another pillar of ordinary community life. Every day, School bus drivers perform a responsibility that many people only recognize when something goes wrong. They transport children safely. They follow careful routes. They become familiar faces in neighborhoods. For many children, the bus driver is one of the first adults they interact with each morning. Someone who helps begin the school day. Someone whose presence becomes part of childhood memories. Johnson was working his route when he was shot. The attack created immediate alarm because it represented another escalation. The sniper had targeted a person connected to children. A person performing a public service. A person whose job required him to be visible within the community. The investigation was now operating under extreme pressure. Authorities knew the attacker was still active. They knew he was capable of waiting. They knew he could choose almost any location. And they knew every day without an arrest created another opportunity for tragedy. Yet the attack on Johnson would become the final fatal shooting in the October 2002 sequence. The public did not know that at the time. There was no announcement saying the nightmare was ending. No dramatic moment when fear disappeared. Instead, people simply continued waiting. Waiting for another headline. Waiting for another emergency broadcast. Waiting for the sound of another gunshot. The 22 days of terror had created a wound that extended far beyond the victims and their families. Entire communities had experienced a form of collective anxiety rarely seen in modern American life. But while millions of people looked outward, searching for a stranger hiding somewhere in the distance, investigators were beginning to discover that the answer might come from somewhere unexpected. The killer had made mistakes. Small ones. Almost invisible ones. A connection between crimes separated by hundreds of miles. A piece of evidence overlooked at first. A name that would slowly move from the margins of the investigation toward the center. The sniper believed he had created the perfect crime. He believed the randomness protected him. He believed the distance between himself and his victims made him untouchable. But every crime leaves a trail. Sometimes the trail is obvious. Sometimes it is buried beneath layers of confusion. And sometimes, the smallest forgotten detail becomes the thread that unravels everything. The final days of the manhunt were approaching. The fear was not over. But the investigation was about to enter its most critical stage. The hunt for the Beltway snipers was no longer only about finding where the next attack would happen. It was about finding the people responsible before another family lost someone they loved. The first crime scene did not look extraordinary. That, perhaps, was the investigators' greatest challenge. There were no shattered storefronts. No overturned vehicles. No signs of a desperate struggle. No frantic witnesses pointing toward a fleeing gunman. At first glance, the parking lot in Wheaton, Maryland, looked almost unchanged from any other grocery store parking lot on an ordinary Wednesday morning. Cars remained parked in neat rows. Shopping carts stood abandoned beside sidewalks. Customers watched from behind police tape, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Only one detail separated this place from every other shopping center across suburban America. A man lay dead on the pavement. For detectives arriving on the morning of October 2, 2002, the scene immediately raised more questions than it answered. Violent crimes usually leave behind a story waiting to be reconstructed. Investigators look for signs of confrontation. They search for footprints, fingerprints, discarded weapons, blood trails, surveillance footage, and witnesses who can describe the moments leading to the attack. Here, almost none of those familiar pieces existed. James Martin had simply fallen. There were no indications that he had argued with anyone. Nobody had reported seeing a person approach him. No one remembered hearing shouting. No vehicle had sped away from the parking lot. The crime scene felt strangely incomplete. Experienced investigators understand that scenes often communicate through what is missing rather than what is present. The absence of evidence can itself become evidence. As forensic technicians moved carefully across the pavement, every inch of the area was photographed before anything was disturbed. Measuring tapes stretched across the asphalt. Evidence markers appeared one by one. Detectives crouched near the victim's position, examining angles, distances, and possible lines of sight. Somewhere, a bullet had been fired. Somewhere, a shooter had been positioned. The challenge was determining where. Initial witness interviews added little clarity. Several people remembered hearing a sharp crack. Others thought they had heard nothing unusual until they noticed commotion nearby. One witness believed the sound had come from behind the shopping center. Another insisted it came from the opposite direction. Human perception under stress is remarkably unreliable. The brain attempts to organize chaos using incomplete information, often filling gaps with assumptions that feel convincing in the moment. Investigators knew this. Every statement mattered. None could be accepted without verification. The medical examination quickly confirmed that Martin had been struck by a single high-velocity rifle round. That finding immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Handguns account for the vast majority of firearm homicides in the United States. Rifle attacks occurring in open public spaces are considerably less common. The precision of the wound suggested distance. Distance suggested planning. This had not been an impulsive act. It appeared deliberate. While detectives continued processing the Wheaton scene, another call interrupted the day. A second shooting. Aspen Hill. Different location. Different victim. The possibility of coincidence rapidly began disappearing. Investigators responding to James Buchanan's home encountered another strangely quiet crime scene. The lawn mower still stood where it had been moments before. Its engine had long since been shut off, but witnesses remembered hearing it continue running after Buchanan collapsed. That image stayed with many investigators for years, a machine faithfully completing its mechanical rhythm while the life of the man operating it had already ended. There was something profoundly unsettling about the contrast. Ordinary life had continued for several seconds before anyone understood it had changed forever. Detectives immediately noticed familiar characteristics. One victim. One shot. No visible suspect. No weapon. No confrontation. Crime scene specialists carefully searched Buchanan's property, examining nearby trees, neighboring yards, rooftops, and possible firing positions. The surrounding suburban landscape presented countless possibilities. Every elevated location attracted attention. Every cluster of trees became a potential hiding place. Yet the shooter had vanished. Again. By late afternoon, investigative meetings became increasingly urgent. The similarities between the two shootings demanded careful comparison. Were investigators dealing with a serial offender? A professional assassin? An individual with military training? Or something entirely different? At that early stage, no theory could be dismissed. Forensic laboratories received the recovered projectiles under strict chain-of-custody procedures. Firearms examiners began studying microscopic markings etched into the bullets by the barrel through which they had traveled. Every firearm leaves unique imperfections. Tiny scratches. Minute grooves. Microscopic characteristics almost impossible to duplicate. To trained examiners, those markings function much like fingerprints. If both bullets originated from the same weapon, science would reveal the connection. The comparison required patience, precision, absolute certainty. Meanwhile, investigators expanded the search far beyond the immediate crime scenes. Traffic cameras were reviewed wherever available. Businesses were contacted regarding surveillance systems. Witnesses were re-interviewed, often multiple times. Neighborhood canvasses continued well into the evening. Officers knocked on doors asking residents whether they had noticed unfamiliar vehicles, unusual sounds, or suspicious behavior. Most had not. Many apologized for being unable to help. Some offered details that appeared promising before collapsing under closer scrutiny. The investigation was already producing hundreds of fragments. Very few fit together. Then came October 3rd. The murder of Dr. Prem Kumar Walekar transformed concern into alarm. The gas station crime scene differed from the previous locations in one important respect. It was far busier. Customers had been filling fuel tanks. Vehicles entered and exited continuously. Employees moved between cash registers and service areas. Surely, investigators hoped, someone had seen something useful. Instead, they encountered the same frustrating pattern. Witnesses heard the shot. They saw the victim collapse. They searched desperately for the shooter. No one found him. Detectives widened the perimeter, examining nearby businesses, wooded areas, rooftops, utility corridors, and elevated terrain. Again, nothing. The sniper seemed to materialize only long enough to fire a single bullet before dissolving back into ordinary life. Ballistics experts soon confirmed what investigators had begun suspecting. The projectiles recovered from the scenes shared distinctive characteristics. The same rifle had almost certainly been used. 3 murders. 1 weapon. 1 offender, or perhaps more than one person operating together. The investigation immediately entered a new phase. No longer were detectives solving individual homicides. They were pursuing an active serial shooter. That realization changed everything. Police commanders expanded coordination across jurisdictions. Information that might once have remained within a single department now moved rapidly between agencies. Federal investigators increased their involvement. Behavioral analysts began constructing offender profiles while intelligence officers reviewed reports that previously seemed unrelated. Every new shooting would now be examined not as an isolated tragedy but as another chapter in a growing pattern. Yet the pattern itself remained maddeningly incomplete. Victims shared no obvious connection. Locations varied. Times differed. No letters had been received. No public demands had been issued. The offender appeared motivated by something investigators could neither identify nor predict. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the absence of physical evidence leading toward a suspect. Experienced criminals often become overconfident. They leave fingerprints, DNA, witnesses, surveillance images, vehicles seen fleeing. The Beltway sniper seemed to leave almost none of it. Only bullets. Only bodies. Only silence. Still, experienced investigators understand an important principle. Every offender makes mistakes. Not because they intend to. Because perfection is impossible. The challenge is recognizing the mistake before another person dies. At that moment, detectives did not yet know where that mistake would appear. They only knew they had to keep searching. Because somewhere beyond the flashing emergency lights, somewhere within the endless stream of vehicles moving around the Capitol Beltway, the person responsible was almost certainly watching the investigation unfold. And he was preparing to strike again. As the number of shootings increased, the investigation expanded at a pace few agencies had ever experienced. What had begun as a pair of baffling homicide investigations quickly transformed into a regional crisis involving local police departments, county detectives, state investigators, federal agents, forensic laboratories, behavioral analysts, and emergency management officials. The challenge was no longer simply solving murders. It was preventing the next one. Every attack created 2 separate investigations. One focused on the victim. The other focused on the shooter. Detectives assigned to victimology worked tirelessly to reconstruct the final hours of each person who had been killed or wounded. They interviewed family members, friends, co-workers, neighbors, and employers. Financial records were reviewed. Telephone calls were examined. Daily routines were mapped in extraordinary detail. The hope was simple. Perhaps one victim had unknowingly crossed paths with the killer. Perhaps there was a connection invisible at first glance. Perhaps a shared location, shared acquaintance, or shared event would reveal a motive. But with every completed profile, investigators reached the same frustrating conclusion. There was nothing linking them. James Martin had never known James Buchanan. Prem Kumar Walekar had never met Sarah Ramos. Linda Franklin's life had never intersected with Conrad Johnson's. They belonged to different generations, different professions, different communities, different cultures, different routines. The absence of connection gradually became one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. The randomness was real. That realization forced investigators to change their strategy. If the victims could not lead detectives to the offender, then perhaps the crime scenes themselves could. Crime scene reconstruction became increasingly sophisticated with each new attack. Surveying equipment was used to calculate possible trajectories. Detectives studied elevations surrounding every location. Maps covered with colored markers slowly accumulated inside command centers, each marker representing another shooting, another family forever changed. Analysts searched for patterns hidden beneath apparent chaos. Did the attacks occur near major highways? Did they favor commercial areas? Were they connected by traffic flow? Could the shooter be selecting locations based on escape routes rather than victims? Those questions generated countless hours of discussion. Every possibility was examined. Every theory challenged. One recurring observation gradually attracted attention. Many of the attacks occurred close to major roads that allowed rapid departure in multiple directions. If the shooter fired from a concealed position, entered traffic within seconds, and blended among thousands of vehicles, witnesses would have almost no chance of following. That possibility was deeply unsettling. The metropolitan area surrounding Washington is built upon movement. Every day, hundreds of thousands of vehicles travel between Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. Sedans, pickup trucks, delivery vans, sport utility vehicles, buses, and commercial trucks fill the highways from before sunrise until late evening. A single vehicle disappearing into that volume of traffic would be extraordinarily difficult to identify. Meanwhile, the forensic investigation continued, producing small but significant advances. Firearms examiners confirmed that bullets recovered from multiple crime scenes shared identical microscopic characteristics. Those markings established that the same Bushmaster .223 caliber rifle had been used repeatedly. That finding carried enormous importance. The attacks were unquestionably connected. Authorities were not searching for several unrelated offenders. They were searching for one rifle and whoever possessed it. Yet identifying the weapon did not identify the person holding it. The distinction mattered. Behavioral analysts from the Federal Bureau of Investigation began constructing offender profiles based on the available evidence. Their task was not to name a suspect but to narrow possibilities by examining behavior. The sniper demonstrated patience, discipline, confidence, an ability to operate under pressure. The precision of the shootings suggested familiarity with firearms, although investigators understood that accurate marksmanship alone could not determine whether the offender possessed military experience. Public speculation increasingly focused on the idea of a trained sniper, but detectives remained careful not to let assumptions become facts. Investigations have been damaged before by theories that seemed persuasive yet proved incorrect. The evidence had to lead, not expectations. Outside police headquarters, the pressure intensified. News organizations established near-constant coverage. Crime scene footage played repeatedly across television screens. Reporters analyzed every official statement, searching for clues hidden within carefully chosen words. The public consumed every update. Some watched out of curiosity. Others watched because they believed the next announcement might determine whether they felt safe leaving home. Emergency telephone lines overflowed with information. Thousands of tips arrived from across the country. Some callers reported suspicious vehicles. Others believed they recognized individuals from composite descriptions. Some claimed psychic visions. Others insisted neighbors behaved strangely. Every tip required documentation. Every tip demanded at least preliminary evaluation. Most ultimately proved unrelated. Yet investigators could not afford to dismiss any possibility too quickly. Somewhere among the overwhelming volume of information might exist the one detail capable of breaking the case open. The sheer scale of the investigation created enormous logistical challenges. Evidence had to move securely between laboratories. Witness interviews required coordination across multiple jurisdictions. Ballistics reports needed rapid distribution. Intelligence had to be shared without compromising operational security. Daily briefings often extended late into the night, only to resume again before dawn when another development demanded immediate attention. Sleep became a luxury. The officers working the case understood something the public also felt. Time favored the sniper. Every day without identification increased the likelihood of another attack. That urgency shaped every decision. Roadblocks were established following shootings. Helicopters searched wooded areas. Patrol officers saturated neighborhoods surrounding crime scenes. Specialized tactical units prepared for the possibility of confronting an armed suspect capable of engaging targets from long distance. Despite these extraordinary efforts, the shooter continued escaping. Each successful attack created another painful contradiction. Law enforcement presence was increasing dramatically. So was the offender's confidence. Some investigators began considering an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the sniper was following media coverage closely. If so, every public statement released by authorities potentially informed future decisions. What investigators revealed could influence how the offender adapted. That concern led officials to become increasingly selective about the information shared during press conferences. Certain details remained confidential. Specific ballistic findings were withheld. Evidence known only to investigators was carefully protected. Those decisions occasionally frustrated reporters and members of the public seeking reassurance, but preserving investigative integrity had become essential. Unknown to nearly everyone outside the command structure, another problem was quietly emerging. Witness descriptions of vehicles refused to align. Some remembered a white van. Others described a box truck. A few mentioned dark-colored sedans. Several witnesses admitted they had noticed nothing until after hearing the gunshot. Investigators understood why. Human memory under sudden stress often prioritizes movement occurring immediately after a shocking event rather than the moments preceding it. People naturally focused on vehicles leaving the area because departure attracted attention, even if those vehicles belonged to innocent drivers. The result was an investigation flooded with conflicting observations. Countless white vans were stopped. Delivery vehicles were searched. Drivers found themselves questioned simply because their vehicles resembled descriptions circulating through news broadcasts. The true offenders remained unnoticed. Somewhere beyond every checkpoint, beyond every police perimeter, and beyond every televised press conference, two individuals continued driving through the region in a vehicle that attracted remarkably little attention. That irony would become one of the defining lessons of the entire case. The investigation possessed skilled detectives, advanced forensic science, extensive public cooperation, national attention. Yet the answer remained hidden behind something profoundly ordinary. An aging Chevrolet Caprice quietly moving through the same roads traveled by millions of completely innocent people. Investigators did not know it yet. But the breakthrough they desperately needed would not emerge from another witness who suddenly remembered the perfect description. It would come from a series of small, seemingly unrelated details that, once connected, would transform an impossible mystery into a solvable case. The first threads of that connection were already beginning to appear. No one had recognized their significance yet.